everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Man, it seems like we can't really ever do anything but history. Like, we do contemporary stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, but we're doing history. We're talking more history, which means I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, CompuBox operator, and just a history guy like myself. Aris, what's up, bro? How are you?
How's everything, man? Everything's going really good. Summer's in full effect. It's hot as hell out here. How's it over there?
Same. Yep. So apologies if the wind kicks up at any point, but I have to have it's got to be open, dude. It's brutal. So
Total.
it's got to happen. But no, it's also, that means that it's the time of year when they can have like outdoor fights and shit like that, which is always nice.
Mm-hmm.
Wish they had the old school Caesar's Palace to have that going, but what are you going to do? You can't have it all anymore, right? Can't
Absolutely.
fucking have it all. But
Nah,
at least
like
this weekend, we are going to have one thing though. We're going to have at least Ryan Garcia versus who's our boy here, dude? Come on.
Javier Fortuna.
Yeah, it's a big fight, massive
Oh,
fight.
it's actually it's a for Ryan Garcia fights are big events, so you
They
can't
are.
whether you like him or don't like him. I know he's a very polarizing individual for boxing, but you can't deny his popularity right now. And anytime that he's going to fight, fans are going to tune in. And Fortuna's a very awkward guy. He's a little past it, but he's tough to fight, hits really hard, ugly style, always makes everybody fight very uncomfortable. You can't really look good against him. And it's going to be interesting to see how Ryan has to deal with that because it's a tough style to go with.
Like you said, dude, like it or not, whether people want it or not, whether you're a fan of his or not, it's kind of like the Jake Paul situation. It's really similar. We see
Remember when they're all buddy buddy on DAZN back in the day too?
Yeah, I don't know. It makes sense, honestly. But honestly, it's like, Ryan Garcia, he's a real fighter. It's not like, and a lot of people will make that judgment about Jake Paul. He's not a real fighter. Obviously, I think that's kind of changing. He's going to be fighting a real fighter pretty soon. So people better start changing their mind if he winds up winning. But either way, point being, with both of them, we see a lot of, especially like old, crusty, resistant to change boxing jerks who are like, refusing to see the fact that the landscape is changing. The way that fighters are promoted and are promoting themselves is changing. Social media is changing a lot of that. And that is leading to the pay and the pay structure in boxing to change a lot. And a lot of people, especially, like I said, like older school fans and stuff like that, don't like that shit. They're very resistant, but it just is how it is. So this weekend, we see Ryan Garcia fighting, going to be a big show overall because he is one of the things that we're talking about today, a teen idol or a matinee idol, some sort of idol, whatever you want to call it. We're talking about those kinds of fighters throughout history. I mean, there's going to be kind of a cutoff because there's only, it's tied to media here. So there's only so far back we can go with that. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of fun fighters to talk about. Before we get to that though, dude, I am curious because we won't go into the specifics on, your ties to this, Garcia knowledge here. Cause you know a little bit about the Garcia camp. Wait, I probably shouldn't say that, huh? But you do know a little bit about, Ryan Garcia's career and the overall goings on and stuff like that, perhaps a little bit more than the average person. That being said, it's a person to be paying attention to as far as a fighter goes,
I mean, dude, he's at his peak of his popularity right now. I mean, he had a little bit of a setback going on with his mental health, and I'm glad he got that taken care of. We all go through our struggles in life, and that's first priority more so than anything. So kudos to him. That being said, his first fight back, I'm not going to say he didn't look that impressive. I mean, I know what was it, Emmanuel Tagoe that he fought? It's again, not a style that's easy to look against, and a very durable guy that'll probably go to distance with you, but Ryan was shaking off a little bit of rust. It's been going on with him, man. And the thing with that is that if you watch him and how he fights, since he's becoming more and more of a star, and you see more of the highlight videos of him and hitting that Cobra bag and doing yada 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 and all this other stuff, you get the sense, even with the trainer changes or whatever it may be, that like he I would say he's almost regressing a little bit, man. Like in terms of like his fundamentals and everything. Like he has a lot of glaring omissions that a person at his level and where he wants to be at can, one of the top guys in the lightweight division and a huge star and all that. he still has a lot of things like flaws out there that might get exploited. I don't know if it's going to happen this weekend, but think about it. The chin high in the air, the lunging in with his punches, the underuse of his jab now, standing straight up, especially if someone gets in on him, like Fortuna is definitely going to. All these things are right there, and these questions need to be answered because Ryan keeps on calling out all these guys. He wants Tank, he wants Devin, whoever is the hot one at the moment that makes a big fight. Ryan goes on Twitter and says, we need to make this fight, yada, yada, yada. He has a lot to prove in this one. He had a lot of momentum going for the Luke Campbell fight. The aforementioned issues that he had to deal with happened afterwards, but he needs to rebuild that again. You know, the to-go fight didn't really work that well for him, and this is an opportunity for him to really, like, show him something. Fortuna has been around the block. He's fought a who's who of the division, given everybody hell that he's fought, whether it's a tall ass guy like Robert Easter or someone like Jojo Diaz or anyone in between. Like, he gives you trouble. He's a tough, awkward guy. And he can hit hard, and he's active, and he can be dirty, and he doesn't really care. Like, he's a crafty guy. He's a veteran. He knows what he's doing in there. And if Ryan is not in top form, you know, this could be a recipe for an upset. I think Ryan could pull through on this one, but it all depends on how he looks too. If he really, you know, this is his second time now with Joe Goose and like with a full camp. I know they worked together previously years ago and stuff and all that, but like there's a lot to unwork with, you know, to undo here, man. He has to like work and rebuild him and really do something. Goosen can do that. He's a great trainer. His track record speaks for itself. But, you know, I'm very curious to see how Ryan's going to look in this fight, man. It's going to be a tough one.
You know, if you were going to ask somebody like, let's say Teddy Atlas, what are one of his, like, you know, signature lines to say about a fighter like Ryan Garcia? He's got no identity. He doesn't know who he is in there.
Yes. Yeah.
But literally, he doesn't. He fights like he doesn't know exactly what style he wants to use. You know, he doesn't know whether or not.
Ryan probably would have went with the Teddy Atlas back in the day. Actually, when you think about it, if Garcia was around in the mid '90s when Teddy became the flavor of the month.
Yeah, the fad trainer. Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't think about it, like, you know, it was the pre-internet age, so you don't really remember it. But Teddy Atlas was the fad trainer at that one time. The stuff he did when Michael Moore, no one had
getting in Foreman's face like that.
Yeah, and
oh my god!
Also, too, I don't know if you
almost lost your life, Teddy.
He got into a fist fight too with a reporter, and
he fought like everybody.
Tyson Holyfield, the Tyson Holyfield press conference. If you watch the beginning intro, Atlas gets in there with some, I don't know who the reporter was. It was mentioned in Ring Magazine at one point, but him and Atlas start barking at each other. Atlas starts swinging. The reporter, who was a former fighter himself, starts swinging.
Yeah, isn't that the one where he walks away and he's all bloodied and stuff?
Yeah, he has a bloody lip, and there's video of it because it was posted up. The Jay Seklow guy.
That's like the third time that I've heard about Teddy getting into it with somebody and getting the worst of it.
And you see Michael Moore, somebody literally carrying Atlas away like a child, and he's kicking and squirming. And the reporter guy is walking away. He just kind of, he's smiling, and he's like, and he's fixing his shirt, and he's walking away smugly, like, yeah, I caught him.
Guy, dude, he's a little bit of what the French call a fucking lunatic, you know. Totally. Just read his book. But honestly, as far as Ryan Garcia goes, honestly though, I do think he fights like he doesn't know quite what he wants to do. Does he want to use distance because he's a fairly lanky fighter? He's got very good hand speed. Does he want to use that and use defense to kind of stay away? Or does he want to kind of dart in and out? Does he want to get into a firefight? He seems like he doesn't really know. And sometimes we'll kind of go back in between. And like you said, one of the biggest issues I see is that he does in a fight as if he's in the gym hitting pads. Yeah. He'll sit there with his chin straight the fuck up, you know, like not covering up at all. And like do the thing where it's like, you know, not bringing his gloves back at all. Like, it's like, man, you are absolutely begging to get just fucking, remember Uzi Ahmed? Remember that awful knockout, like where he's like, you know, just gets folded like backward like a lawn chair.
One of the first memes of the early days of boxing Twitter, right?
Yes. Yeah, the dancing and then just getting totally obliterated. Yeah, bro. He's just asking for some awful knockout like that. Because
it almost happened with Luke Campbell.
Well, and Luke Campbell's not a big puncher. Luke Campbell's, you know, already shown he's got a pretty good ceiling that seemed as though it was lower than Ryan Garcia. But, anyway, raises questions. And I think that you're pretty spot on here, that there's a lot of distractions, a lot of kind of X factors, a lot of extracurriculars, whatever you want to call them, with Ryan Garcia, that make it really tough to know exactly, whether or not you can depend on him, and whether or not he's going to continue to go up steadily as far as the rankings go, because you would think that on paper, he should defeat somebody like a Javier Fortuna. He should defeat somebody like that. But a lot of these kind of X factors make it tough. And on top of that, like you said, Javier Fortuna is the kind of guy who we were talking about this a minute ago, but I think he was signed to Top Rank earlier in his career, but kind of marketed as, obviously not the next Trinidad. He's Dominican, he's not Puerto Rican, but kind of in that vein. Definitely perhaps next Juan Guzman, I suppose, but definitely an explosive fighter, a very quick fighter, someone who was promising, had a very good amateur career, and who should be the next kind of featherweight-ish area thing, lightweight thing, and kind of fizzled out, or didn't quite meet expectations, or was not looking like he would, and then wound up getting taken out pretty good by a dude named Jason Sosa a couple of years ago. Who, where the fuck is Jason? Where's that guy? It was a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, Burchell splattered him, and kind of,
man, I know, it's just
tough guy, man, gritty guy, but
had a really good 18-month window, and then kind of just went another direction. But in any case, that also possibly says, what we're talking about here with Javier Fortuna, if that Jason Sosa was the guy to kind of just, expose that crack in the armor. But Jason Sosa, where the hell is he? It's like, well, this might be bad on paper, but those X factors do bring up a lot of questions. And if Fortuna can get some punches in there, who knows? We don't really know exactly how reliable Garcia is. So is it the kind of fight that's like a great main event? Like, not really, to be honest, but it is intriguing.
No, it's a very intriguing one. Any Ryan Garcia fight where he's fighting an actual name, not just like an also ran where, like To Go kind of was for him, then it's going to be intriguing, because people want to see that. Like, again, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show, there's people out there that just want to see Garcia get splattered. They tune in hoping just to see a punch of him get knocked senseless. There's
That's
others
going to be
a
recurring theme for the fighters today too, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Same thing goes on for like his promoter. Well, we'll talk about it in a little bit. You know what I mean? But like, there's people out there they just hate for whatever reason. Other people out there, they are big fans. Like the other Garcia fans out there, what makes him so popular, obviously, is like the young fan base who just worship him. He's one of the main. He's one of the early fighters out there who, like, the main guys who you can say from this whole like TikTok era and social media era, that really just he became a star basically through that, the videos, his good looks, everything like that. And look at all these his fans who obviously never watched a boxing match in their life until they met Ryan, until they saw Ryan. That they, in the early days when he first started coming on the scene and everyone was just, catching his attention, it was like, oh man, you would see the signs in the audience. I remember there's like signs out there, Ryan Garcia, will you marry me, love you? Like, people flaunted all when he fought the veteran Velez, Jason Velez.
Jason Velez, yeah.
When he fought Velez, remember the hype before that fight? Everyone going nuts because everyone thought at that point Garcia was like,
he was like 18 or 19 at the time, or whatever it was. Yeah.
And everyone was assuming at that point that he was like the future champion of the division, because he looked it, you know what I mean, from all his highlight videos and everything he did. But then he looked normal against Velez. Velez, who was always a tough guy that tested everybody, tested him, gave him a really tough fight. And from there, like his performances, I mean, he scored a lot of spectacular knockouts against lesser opposition, with the exception of, I guess, maybe Duno. But like, he was always a little bit spotty. But then there was like the weird things going on afterwards, after those knockouts. Like, I guess he was close to that fight with Tank. All of a sudden, he veers to the side, and now he's going to fight Manny Pacquiao, of all people. And then,
yeah, that was weird.
That was weird. I mean, intriguing, but like totally out of left field and kind of
yeah.
And then that falls apart. And then he goes back to kind of just like calling out random people, and then the Luke Campbell fight sooner or later happens, and now we're here.
The fact of the matter is, he's fought 4 times in 3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a lot. And I know that he's young, but that seems like a lot. And on top of that, I'm not trying to talk shit about the issues with his, you know, potential mental illness, and addressing that stuff. That's great. And I think that being open about that type of stuff is really valuable.
Mhm.
But just in terms of looking at his career, putting that aside, you know, the human part aside, and looking at his career, he's fought 4 times in 3 years. As a young fighter, that's not real great. And I think that also has shown in his last couple of performances that he's been inactive and that he has looked kind of rusty, looked kind of unsure of himself.
Mhm.
And when you pair that with the way that he's talked, like the way that he continues to talk, it's just kind of like, I think that he's losing a lot of the hardcore base if he had much at all, because they're kind of just like, dude, you're just using Tank's name to promote yourself.
Well,
You're
that's
just,
what
you
he's
know,
been doing with a lot of. That's what everyone feels he's been doing. It's not even
he
just Tank.
is.
Tank's the main one that he goes for all the time because of
There's
that rivalry.
no, yeah, there's no, that we can tell, there's no apparent sincere effort from the Garcia camp to make these fights, nor,
No,
you
it's just
know,
like, hey, I'm a big star. You should fight me. We can make, that's what the basis of it is usually.
yeah, or betting against him, well, you know, for Raleigh Romero.
Or
At
like
least
calling
there's,
out Haney, oh, I'll knock out Haney, but he doesn't want to fight me, yada yada yada.
at least there's a
He
couple
hasn't called
memes
out
from it.
Shakur yet, but when Shakur moves up, I'm sure he'll start yelling about him too.
You know, yeah, I'm sure, but it's all just empty talk until there's something. It's all just empty
Totally.
talk. But that being said, this weekend, what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I think Ryan should be able to win this fight if, considering all things considered. I'm just curious to see how he looks. I'm going to see like with another camp with Goosen now that he's being more active. This is a quick turnaround for him, and I'm glad to see that. So this is relatively quick turnaround for him. So
It is,
like,
yeah. I'll give him credit for that. Yeah, because I was
yeah,
just saying he was inactive. So I do have to give him credit.
so it's a good quick turnaround for him, and if he got the rust out of him, then I'm curious to see how he's looking with Goosen, and if he can do enough. Like I said, I think Fortuna's a little past it, but still a tough guy, and I think he'll be awkward. But I think Garcia will win, probably by stoppage, by later, stoppage or decision, like late stoppage. If he blasts him out early, then I'll be really impressed.
Well, you better fucking get inside on him now.
Oh yeah, I just watched that the other day. I think I watch it at least once every 2 weeks or so.
I think that's a solid call. I think probably like a late stoppage,
Mhm.
maybe a decision, like a commanding decision type of thing, is
Yeah, if it went to a
probably a good
decision, I
call.
think he'd probably win like a solid decision, with room to spare.
Yeah.
But
If he
it's not
could,
going to be like it's going to be an awkward fight too, though. I think like Fortuna makes a lot of fights very awkward and ugly, and Garcia doesn't really know how to fight guys like that. Still, like he's a very stand-up fighter, so it's going to make for a very awkward affair.
yeah, I agree. He's not somebody who knows how to adjust and cope with a difficult fighter right away that we've seen.
Yeah,
So it's
he's
probably
definitely
not
not an inside fighter. So
and like you said, I think that if it's a blowout or if it's like a really explosive ending type of thing, that should be considered fairly impressive.
definitely.
Like not career defining, but impressive, and something
Mhm.
that should take him up from there. And that's what we're looking for. So I agree. I think he'll win, and it probably should be either a late stoppage or a decision. Anything before that, impressive for sure.
Totally. Absolutely.
So as far as these like idols go, as far as these from the past, these kind of teen idols, matinee idols, whatever you want to call them, what's a good one you got to open up with here?
Maybe cliche or whatever, but you gotta start with Ryan's promoter. Just
Why not?
because literally that one might have been he was when I came onto the holy shit. Ugh, excuse me. Um when I first became a fan, Oscar De La Hoya was one of my first favorite fighters. And I remember hearing all the backlash reading in magazines how there were a lot of people you'd read in the come out writing sections at Ring Magazine and KO. Some of the other writers like Mike Katz and others would just criticize him. Well, there's a lot of people that did not like Oscar either, but
Yeah.
I was an Oscar fan. So yeah.
I think that he was kind of the Ryan Garcia, the reaction to Ryan Garcia is pretty demonstrative because it's pretty similar to
Mhm.
how the reaction to Oscar De La Hoya was, until I think Oscar De La Hoya kind of got his detractors shutting up a little more early. He was a little more consistent with his work. He was busier. He was, the win over, what is it? Breedall.
Jimmy Bradell.
Yeah, that was a little bit of a cherry pick. You know, we know that, but regardless, it was clear that he was going for something a little bit different. Whereas Ryan Garcia's career has stalled a little bit in comparison.
Well, two different eras too. You know what I mean?
No,
Like,
no question. And on
that
top of
was
that, the
crazy.
Olympic
It's
gold
crazy to
medal.
think too. Yeah, it's been 30 years now, basically.
Yeah, that's massive.
Since Oscar won the gold medal at the '92 Olympics.
I remember that. I totally remember that. I remember the
Yeah.
stories about his mom, and I remember that very well.
'92 Olympics was the first one I remember watching too, like when my
Me
dad
too.
was kind of sitting.
Me too. Yeah.
Definitely don't remember watching it as a 4-year-old in '88. So, but yeah, Oscar turned pro, and like, but the thing also too would like, he turned pro in a tougher era. You know what I mean? Like in terms of like crowds as well, I would think like more critical and just like really like the LA West Coast crowds of 70s, 60s from before 80s, not always just very hardcore, love their tough guys, what everything. Oscar was never really embraced as that. You know what I mean? He was so clean cut and baby faced and not really considered, I guess. Am I being right here that he wasn't considered like a true Mexican, I guess, in the eyes of a lot of people? So like,
yeah,
you know, he wasn't macho enough for a lot of it. He just wasn't that type of guy. They had Chavez. They had guys, you know, think of you getting the same thing I'm getting, bro.
Yeah, what the fuck? Yeah, Gennaro Hernandez. There were a number of fighters from around that time who were also good looking, but I mean, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm the supreme understander of the dynamic between Mexicans and Mexican Americans or Chicano culture or anything. I'm especially as a white guy, I don't know that shit, especially not firsthand. But I did grow up in Southern California, so I feel like I probably know a little bit more about it than somebody who did not. That being said, there were other fighters who were Mexican, who were born in Mexico, who were also good looking, who were also box office attractions around that time. So if you were in the Southern California area, you didn't have to like Oscar De La Hoya. He was kind of like one of many options as far as like Hispanic fighters or Latin fighters, however you want to describe them, that you could be a fan of. And on top of that, he wasn't even the only Mexican or Mexican American fighter on the 1992 team. In Raul Marquez, Diamante, he was on the 1992 team as a junior middleweight. And although he was born in Mexico, he had moved to Texas. And I think that he was just dialed into a different different kind of Mexican American community, but also he spoke Spanish fluently. And, you know, I think that made it a little bit different for him. So anyway, point being, it wasn't like Oscar De La Hoya was the only option for like a 8 to 15 to 20-year-old or whatever, like Hispanic boxing fan, you know, to be a fan of. There were many fighters that they could be fans of, but Oscar De La Hoya did definitely represent a certain kind of demographic among them, or a different slice of them, for sure. It was just that it's difficult. That's always been, I think, difficult to navigate in the Mexican and Mexican American communities, where generally speaking, the stereotype when it comes to boxing, that is that you need to be tough, you need to be rugged, you need to never say die, you don't give a fuck if you got a cut, like you're going forward, you know, you're going out on your shield, whatever the case may be. We clearly know as boxing fans of like the past that that's not how it is. There have been countless Mexican fighters over the decades that have been great boxer punchers and supreme boxers, etc. It's not just one style, but that is the stereotype, and that is the aesthetic. That is, generally speaking, what's valued. And so a pretty boy who kind of speaks softly is maybe dialed into his emotions a little bit more, because his emotions are part of his story that they're trying to push on people, as far as his mom dying. And I don't, again, not trying to make light of it or talk shit of it, but as far as the promotion of it, you know, I think that made it tough for a lot of people to digest.
And then, and the fact of the matter is that also too, they felt that he was being pushed to the moon without really being tested.
That
you know,
too,
you gotta think, when he first turned pro, if you look at his record on BoxRec, like he fought solid. they weren't like absolute cupcake fighters, but like, you know, it wasn't murderers row themselves. And he was still, you know, he was like, he was
It
still
was carefully navigated.
Yes, it was totally carefully navigated, as most top ranked prospects always are. I mean, that's why they have the track record that they do over the years. Can't knock them for that. But like, you know, when he finally like stepped up and fought an actual name, he fought Jeff Mayweather. Most people know him obviously as Roger, as Floyd Mayweather's uncle, the lesser known of the two brothers, but he was always just known as a fringe contender. When he finally fought like a former world champion, it was Troy Dorsey. And if you know Troy Dorsey and you can pitch him up to ask Oscar De La Hoya, it's almost like putting Muggsy Bogues compared to Charles Barkley. It's, you know, height difference there was absurd.
That's what also made it so comical and people so critical of him early on, was that they felt like he was kind of gaming the system weight wise, because he was so big. I mean, when you fight
a guy like Dorsey was a very tiny guy that was going neck to neck with Jorge Paez, another future De La Hoya victim. But you know, that was like his height. And Dorsey was a come forward guy. He wasn't
like a lightweight. He was they made De La Hoya look like a killer at lightweight, you know?
And so De La Hoya pasted him around the ring. Dorsey, to his credit, didn't get knocked down. He just got cut. But like he, you know, got blessed. So that was going on with him early on. And the aforementioned Bradell, who went on to have a really solid career later on, you know, a few years later, I think, as a champion. But he, at that point, he was just, you know, a novice himself against De La Hoya, chosen merely for the fact so Oscar could pick up a WBO belt, which considered in 1994 was next to nothing. So it wasn't until, in my opinion, that when he fought John Molina, the rugged, very, very tough former junior lightweight champion, and a guy who was comparable to size to De La Hoya, very savvy, very tough, and wasn't easy to knock out. That's when De La Hoya started earning his stripes, because Molina gave him some business that night.
Yeah, Molina was a tough dude. That guy probably should be. Man. Yeah, he should probably get a little bit more credit.
Doesn't get talked about enough. Yeah.
Now, and on top of that, a rugged dude, a tough dude, a pretty good puncher, and in some pretty decent fights too.
Oh no, absolutely, man. He gave De La Hoya a tough fight. It got dropped early on. He was wearing, I think he was wearing a hairpiece they did, because De La Hoya said he wanted to knock it off, but he couldn't. And but yeah, Molina went the distance and marked him up and gave him a rough fight. And then soon after that, you know, you would see him in subsequent fights. He gave a prime Shane Mosley at lightweight absolute hell for a few rounds before he got stopped. He beat a few, you know, fringe contenders. He was around until the early 2000s, man. Tough guy.
And one of the a somewhat underrated trilogy. I'm not going to pretend like it was like, you know, fantastic.
Tony Lopez.
Yeah, dude, Tony the Tiger Lopez. Pretty good trilogy. Pretty good trilogy between them. And anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's when, like, you know, because he knocked out Paez before that. But again, Paez was another extremely undersized guy compared to De La Hoya. When he beat Molina, and Molina actually gave him a fight that people wanted to see, like Oscar won with room to spare, but like Molina gave, I remember that was one of the first fights I watched live with my dad, I would think. And I think my mom watched it too. And like, I remember I was like, oh, wow, you know, because I thought Oscar was going to blast him, because I had no idea who Molina was.
And yeah, Molina scrapped back in that fight.
He did. But from there, that's when everything skyrocketed. You know what I mean? Because his very next fight was the pay-per-view rival, his pay-per-view rival, Rafael Ruelas. And that was the whole crosstown where everything came into question. And you can talk about the popularity, you know?
Yeah, dude, the Ruelas brothers definitely had also kind of their own following in Southern California. And they were with Ten Goose Jim, you know, Goosen brothers had handled their careers. I don't know if from the beginning, but I know from pretty early on. And yeah, like I know that they had kind of they were also kind of quintessential Mexican American, you know, I guess, as far as that dynamic goes, they revisited that several times for De La Hoya, even earlier in his career, just kind of that crosstown rivalry, or like, you know, here's this prospect and we're pitting him against this prospect type of thing. You know, they did that a lot for him.
Mm-hmm. For this fight too, man, it was like, there was a whole background. Ruelas and De La Hoya didn't like each other. I think they had fought as amateurs, or they had sparred something or another, but there was always just like a lot of back and forth. Ruelas was talking about how he was more macho, more tougher, he was going to knock him out, stronger, yada yada yada. Oscar,
how embarrassing! How many people said that to Oscar and then got slapped around?
And that's what happened to him, man. And Ruelas, who was a tough guy, but you know, he was a pretty clumsy fighter too. You know, kind of walk forward, chin in the air. Just churned, tough dude, but Oscar picked him apart, man. That was a brutal knockout. Just pop, 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 just splattered him. But that was a career-defining performance for him. But again, people started criticizing Oscar again after that because it looked like he was cherry picking. He fought Jesse James Leija soon after that, who was extremely undersized, tough, crafty guy, somewhat underrated. Daryl Tyson, who was, but that was a tune-up fight. And Genaro Hernandez, the aforementioned late Chicanito Genaro Hernandez. Well, not so much he was criticized for that.
Nicest guy freaking ever.
Oh, from all accounts, I wish I could have met him, but I heard he was an absolute prince.
Super nice guy, yeah.
Yeah. You got to meet him a couple of times?
Yeah, he was I think that it was because he was on the Spanish language broadcast team for I think it was at the time HBO Latino.
Okay.
I believe. Whatever it was, he was on some broadcast team and he was in Vegas a couple times. But the last time he came and he hung out with us in a lounge in Vegas a couple times, but the last time, and I have some photos, he looked kind of sickly. He didn't look super good. I think it was after he had already started fighting cancer. But anyway, long story short, just one of the nicest guys I've ever met in boxing.
Yeah, he worked for CompuBox as well. And
yeah, that I didn't know.
Yeah, he did. But
maybe that's what it was, but I'm pretty sure he was on a broadcast team at some point.
Well, he did. He definitely did that. But yeah, it's just absolute great guy. But gave Oscar De La Hoya a good fight too. It wasn't bad, and he was comparable in size compared to others. But that was the night that Hernandez had his nose shattered into like an eggshell. It was really, really brutal stuff. But again, Oscar had to go through more when he had to fight a guy like Chavez. I know we're going through like a career retrospective, but like this is what it deals with. You know what I mean? Is when he fought Chavez the first time when like things really came to a head in terms of popularity and all that, because now he's fighting the hero of Mexico, the dude that is like been God to that country and to a lot of other people in the world for going on to since the mid 80s. And he's been invincible. And even though he lost and he's been slowed down a little bit, he's still considered a god. And De La Hoya is a mere mortal compared to him.
So growing up in San Diego, needless to say, it's there are a lot of Mexicans in San Diego, which is one of the big reasons why I don't know how I would say it. I guess I just enjoy Mexican culture overall. But in any case, I do remember I had a lot of Mexican friends growing up too. But I remember in junior high when I was in 8th grade, I remember being in PE because I had PE and that was my first class of the day. It was like fucking 7:30 in the morning or whatever the fuck it was. And
I had that class too.
Oh, dude, it was so awful.
Absolute work.
And we were always outside because it's San Diego. So it's like never raining. So you're always outside no matter what, which in a way is good, but in a way also kind of sucked. Point is we're outside in these like handball courts. And my Mexican homeboys are over here talking about De La Hoya Chavez. It was like a couple of weeks before the year ended or something like that. I remember that shit. They're like arguing about it and shit. One friend is mad and saying Chavez is going to win. Next one, the other one's like, come on, dude, Oscar De La Hoya is going to work him. And anyway, that was again kind of falling back on this dynamic between this push and pull between like whether or not Oscar De La Hoya is Mexican enough. I mean, dude, he faced that his entire career. A lot of the problems he faces to this day are of his own making. I'm not going to try to make too many excuses.
Oh no, it's De La Hoya we knew in the 90s. And what they were talking about is a whole different animal from
I mean, this is
today. So,
but you do have to, I think, on some level, kind of like perhaps even a Mike Tyson, feel bad for him because the microscope was really on him. There was a lot of pressure to be something perhaps he didn't feel he was, or didn't want to be, or wanted to be a different way. I don't know. Who knows? So you do kind of have to feel bad for him because he did everything that was asked of him.
But imagine the people that were in charge of like keeping him in line back when he was like, because you can't tell me that he wasn't running around running around back in the day in the 90s.
I think that right around the Chavez fight, like right around the Chavez fights, I should say, I think that's where it started kind of spiraling. That's where it started kind of kicking up. You know what I'm saying? For him, like in the background where he started getting into trouble. And we can verify for sure that it was the late 90s that he really started getting into trouble.
Totally. After the Pop album came out.
Yeah. Well,
I don't even know. When did that even come out? When was that, the late 90s?
I want to say 98, maybe 99
Okay,
ish.
sounds about right. Yeah.
But this recurring theme we're seeing with a lot of these fighters who are generally speaking young, good looking, we're going to see it again,
Mhm.
but it's like the fame goes to their head, you know, this amount of notoriety and the attention they get, especially from women. Another common theme is that it goes to their head and it winds up, I'm not saying the women themselves, it's the men and the way they deal with the women,
Yeah.
not the women. Let me make sure that's understood. But that's, you know, it fucks them up. And the same thing happened with Oscar. You know, when he defeats Julio Cesar Chavez, it definitely opens up a little bit of a rift, I think, among Mexican fans we've seen this. It's a bit stereotypical, probably played up a bit much, but it's nonetheless true. When one guy defeats the old idol or the old whatever, you know, the old hero, like now that guy's hated, at least temporarily. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
like
the old
fuck
adage.
that guy, you know?
I mean,
That's how
like
it goes.
Marciano, not so much, I guess, because people loved him already. But Larry Holmes definitely. That's a prime example. You know.
It's happened like so many times. And so I think that we saw a little bit of that dynamic, and that also we
Well,
still
especially with
continued.
the way the fight ended, kind of anticlimactically. You know what I mean? With Chavez just suffering a gnarly cut from a punch that wasn't even really hard. It was just like a jab or something. Then you find out beforehand that his kid, which I don't know if it was Omar Chavez Jr., that actually sliced him play fighting with his dad beforehand. So that whole fight was just that whole promotion, bro, was a clusterfuck. All right, man. That whole thing from Aram deciding to try to stick it to pay per view, so he wanted to put it on closed circuit like it was the '70s, and people talking about going to the theaters and all kinds of things being messed up, nothing working, the satellites out, like a typical fight back in the '70s. And then Aram thinking he was going to go back to closed circuit and close out pay per view somehow, and immediately went back to pay per view after that. Like, ugh. Man, that whole card was just weird. Very, very odd.
Well, and after that, De La Hoya went to Miguel Angel Gonzalez, who at the time was a pretty good fighter and undefeated. But then
Yeah.
that kicked off his welterweight run, which
And
was
that's at that point, I think he had earned the respect from everyone in generally and kind of kicked that stigma of just being, whatever.
why I think that the getting the decision over Whitaker, like it didn't really help him in terms of what people thought of him. Like I think that they felt that his fame and notoriety helped him get that decision,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't like he was out of that fight. It wasn't like he totally embarrassed himself in that fight, like a lot of people like to pretend. Like, no, Whitaker kicked the shit out of him. It's like,
Nah, it
no, he
was a
didn't.
relatively
It was a
close
close
fight.
fight. You know, it was a
It
close
was
fight
just
that I
parts
felt
that
Whitaker
Whitaker made him
probably
look
should have won.
stupid in it. But I mean, Whitaker make everybody look stupid.
Yeah, and I felt Purnell probably should have won the fight, but I'm not like sad that Oscar won. You know, I get it.
Nah,
Um,
it was a clash of styles, and Oscar having Professor, what was it, Professor Rivero, Jesus Rivero in his corner that night probably didn't help matters because that guy was a more defense oriented boxing trainer. And fighting like that against Whitaker is definitely not going to help to your advantage. So
yeah, he tried to box with him
he
far,
tried it.
far too much.
And that, so
Yeah, and his welterweight run though, I mean, and something that they this kind of started here, and this is something that you know you can't criticize Oscar for. He fought basically everybody he should have fought at welterweight and around welterweight at that time because he did. Whether you thought he won is obviously a different story. But again, as we were talking about, this is also kind of when his notoriety and fame really skyrocketed. But when he really started also getting into trouble was when he started the first couple times that he was publicly accused of sexual assault. I mean, like it happened several times. And then it wound up in the early 2000s coming out that he had like several children out of wedlock. And I mean, it wasn't just that, it went deeper than that. Like children he was like denying. And it was, anyway, I don't want to get too much into the specifics, just the downfall. And that was clearly, it's actually kind of amazing how long the downfall was and how long he was still a fighter after the downfall, to be honest.
totally. I mean, he was always going to be a star in the thing, but like one thing he had to give De La Hoya credit for is that even with all of his outside distractions and everything he was going when he started training and got ready for a fight, he got into tip top shape. And he took that seriously and always brought himself to the best and to his peak, usually. And with all that being said, too, like he always, was a great fighter. So with him always being in top shape, and especially when he got motivated for fights, like he became more so like near the end of his, like in the mid 2000s, started picking and choosing his opponents because he was that guy in boxing that could do that. He had been that guy for years, but instead of just like, okay, I'm gonna fight like a Javier Castillo just to pick up this belt, like he wanted like big fights. Came back, fought Mayorga, who was still a name. All right, waited a little bit. Now I'm gonna fight Mayweather soon after. Like picking fights, trying to choose around, and like
when he
the ones
came
that he
back,
felt would motivate him.
when he came back from the Mosley fight and fought Arturo Gatti, I think that was, to me, when it was like kind of signaled that he was like, I don't want to say phoning it in, because he didn't phone it in, but it was almost kind of like he was saying like, dude, I'm just going to fight whoever the fuck I want. There's nothing you could say about it.
Totally.
I'm way bigger than this dude, and I'm just gonna slap the shit out of him. And he did. That's precisely what he did.
Yeah,
and it was ugly, and it was kind of just like,
God bless Gotti, because he fought his heart out that night too.
Yeah, he went in there and he did it, but it was just, De La Hoya was out of his class and far too big.
Huge. Just blasted him, bro.
Bro, you got gamashed, bro. You got Joey gamashed, man.
Totally. Oscar, I'll give him that, man. Well, all of his misgivings and everything I'm not talking about his outside the ring stuff, but like all the stuff that he went through during his career, I think at the end of it, he was able to gain universal respect and admiration for everybody. I'll say this much: when he fought Trinidad, he definitely had the Mexican public on his side for that one, until he pulled the stunt that he did.
Yeah, until like round 8. Yeah.
Yes. But like it took a while, and it did, but I think he crossed over that hump.
And that fight, I have rewatched that fight a few times.
Oh God, sorry.
But it's like there are a few rounds where almost nothing happens offensively. Like there's almost no meaningful, like a couple punches land, but they do almost no damage. And I'm just looking at it going like, wow, like how? Ay. Crazy though. But in any case, there's absolutely no question that in the last few decades, Oscar De La Hoya has been a massive star, and a lot of it in that earlier part of his career was kind of teen idol status,
Oh, absolutely. He if you like, even more so, I guess, than Ryan. Like I know Ryan had the ability of social media and all that, but there was, when I tell people, man, like
imagine if Oscar did though,
Yeah, dude, off the charts. I can't even imagine. Remember, all right, for instance, you want to talk about the popularity of De La Hoya compared to anybody else. Think of the Patrick Charpentier fight. All right. That dude was Charpentier wasn't even a contender. How he got into position to fight De La Hoya for the belt, God knows how. But somehow against an absolute no-hoper, not even imagine. Where did they put that fight? In the Alamo Dome or something?
Oh, I'd have to look, but
actually, hold up, I can tell you.
Sun Bowl in El Paso.
Okay, Sun Bowl in El Paso, but huge, packed to the rafters, completely. Like I remember, it was jam packed, and it was crazy. And they had people. I think some lady made the front cover of the Ring magazine because she had a big sign up that said "I love you, Oscar," or "Marry me, Oscar," or some shit like that. And yeah, it was crazy. It was like that was Oscar mania at its peak right there.
Honestly, going into the early 2000s, dude, we used to joke about it, and it would be that if you went to Las Vegas, if you went to like a big fight in Las Vegas, that was different than going to a big fight like other places. I would imagine that going to a big fight in Madison Square Garden has that similar kind of feel, big fight feel to it. But then when you went to Vegas for a De La Hoya fight, different animal.
Totally.
And the amount of women that showed up for it.
So I've heard.
Just different, bro. Just different. That's it. I mean, yeah, he drew the women, bro. Like, I mean, he still does. He still does even now. Obviously not to that degree. USSA.
Yeah, baby.
Yeah, baby. USSA, baby. Yeah. It sounds like me at like 18 after like 3 Zimas. Fucking guy. But yeah, but you know, teen idol status confirmed. Absolutely no question. So let's take it back a little bit. Let's take it back and let's just go, let's draw a direct chain from one golden boy to another then.
Sounds good. I think I know where you're going with this one.
Yeah, of course. You know, the one of the original golden boys, but look, every time we do this, I have to do some sort of like outside of boxing type of history lesson just because
Sure.
I wouldn't be me if I didn't do this. So allow Aris a moment to scoff and go, this fucking guy. But look, Southern California is really important for kind of like this era that we're kind of talking about. Earlier in the show, I brought up kind of a time limit or whatever for the fighters we could talk about, because obviously this teen idol type of or matinee idol type of thing is limited somewhat to how media can portray these fighters and how they are consumed by the public, I guess. And so it really wasn't until the 1940s and 50s that we started to see like magazines and other kinds of media hyping up fighters who were like good looking and things like that. That's not to say that there weren't good looking fighters or fighters who were recognized for their looks before this. It's just that you know, that a big reason for this was the way that some of the population was changing in a certain couple parts of the United States, specifically Southern California. So, like, for instance, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a bunch of job contracts had helped initiate basically a wave of Mexican immigrants into Southern California and specifically Los Angeles. And so from that point, from the early 1900s until World War II, it kind of happened a few different times where there were like waves of specifically Mexican immigrants into Southern California. And during World War II, there was a big labor shortage. Actually, I mean, there were shortages of everything. And so for boxing fans or fans of like collecting boxing memorabilia, like myself or like Aris or like some of the people who listen or watch, what that also means is that sometimes it's a real pain in the ass to find issues of the ring from World War II because there was a paper shortage. So like, for instance, I have a bunch of really, really nice copies of some 1930s issues of the ring, like really nice, but you can't find really nice copies of issues of the ring from World War II very often. And if you can, they're usually more expensive than a usual issue for this very reason, because there were a bunch of shortages. Point being, the labor shortages led to a bunch of Mexican immigrants being brought in to work. And so, for instance, there was something called the Bracero program that was started in 1942. I'll get to the boxing, I swear. But it was basically just an agreement that guaranteed immigrant workers food, shelter, etc., in exchange for their labor. So in the 1940s and 50s, the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, it became really hugely important to the fight community in Southern California, and especially to Mexican and Mexican American fight fans. A handful of the fighters that we're talking about today fought at the Olympic Auditorium. And I mean, we'll come back to that. There's a really good documentary called 18th and Grand about the Olympic Auditorium too, that I'd highly recommend, that goes into a lot of the wrestling background and boxing background of the auditorium. But in any case, the auditorium figures prominently in some of these fighters today. But Art Aragon was the original Golden Boy. And so hopefully I kind of set the stage a little bit so people understand, I guess, the dynamic around the Olympic Auditorium in Southern California, where a lot of these kind of teen idols and matinee idols were produced, obviously because of the proximity of Hollywood too, and the kind of classic Hollywood era or golden Hollywood eras in the 40s and 50s, where there were also a lot of boxing movies, and a lot of great classic movies were about boxing, or in one way or another had boxing as a backdrop. But Art Aragon was a young guy who had 13 amateur fights, but he nonetheless went on to be still, I believe, the record holder for sellouts at the Olympic Auditorium. But he was a famous womanizer. He was a guy that people called arrogant art. He was booed if he won, booed if he lost. He dated Mamie Van Doren, who was a famous actress. He was rumored to be romantically linked to like several other famous actresses around the time. And yeah, he was really kind of a mixture of beloved and hated, depending on, I guess, the day or the opponent in Southern California, but definitely one of the original kind of idols.
Dude, he was absolute popular, man. You couldn't really beat the guy that Aragon was. He, in the 50s, the person that I guess you can only rival being a bit as big a heel as him would be someone like Gorgeous George in wrestling.
Yep.
Totally. Being honest. Like someone that just reveled in being a heel. He loved being a bad guy. He liked booing. He liked the crowd booing at him. He liked when he knocked down an opponent and beat him up. He would sneer at them and stuff like that. Like he enjoyed that stuff. Women loved him because he was a bad boy. Some of them did. Other people just wanted to see him, see his face get splattered. And to his credit, he fought a who's who in Southern California, man. Like there was a lot of really, really tough guys out there. Guys like Carlos Chavez, who I don't want to say because I actually looked up on that fight before we started, and it looked like that he might have taken a dive on that shit, or he claims that he did. But another one like Philip Kim, who was a really, really tough guy, and that was a big fight that was built up for that point. Aragon beat him to oblivion. He built himself up to the point where he was able to get a title shot against Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a very peculiar case as the 50s lightweight champion in a weird time period, which obviously we've documented before because boxing at that point was completely controlled by the mob, IBC. Yeah. So Carter was the type of fighter who on any particular day he can look very good or he can look very bad. Depending on, you didn't really know what was going on out there. But as his wont, Carter was the type of fighter that, like, when it came to title fights, he could be up and down, but when it came to non-title fights, which at that point didn't really matter much, he was prone to lose them at points, which he did at this fight to Aragon. And losing a non-title fight to Aragon, which meant that he was going to get a big title fight with him afterwards. And at that one, Carter actually turned on the heat for that one and beat him up, beat Aragon silly, dropped him a few times, won a commanding decision. But from there, he never became like a guy that he never really reached that potential to be a world champion, but he didn't need to be that because he was already at that point of that like popularity that the best way to describe it to another wrestler, for instance, Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper never had to become a world champion. He was the character of him was so good and what he did and his popularity wise and how much he can get the crowd to react, either love him or hate him or whatever it may be, that was good enough right there. Aragon obviously wanted to be world champion. He had a long career and he fought a who's who of everybody. But when you look down upon it and you think about it, like he didn't have to be a champion to be as popular as he was. Hell, he was one of the most popular fighters of that generation of that time. And he wasn't a champion. But I tell you right now, he was much more popular than a lot of the clean cut, very quiet, mundane guys of that time period. Because, during that time, it was a very, it was suburban America. People weren't used to a loudmouth like Aragon.
Right. And even now, people still try to say that there's like these unwritten rules about boxing and etiquette. Oh, totally. And it's a gentleman's sport. And it's like, no,
a gentleman's sport, really?
What? Come on, you don't listen to our fucking podcast. Gentleman's sport. Yeah, it's they still try to impress these kinds of weird kind of etiquette or whatever rules. And back then, even more so, where you're supposed to act a certain way. Now, if fighters start pushing at a press conference or pushing it away in, that's just kind of normal. Back then, that would have been a big thing. Like that doesn't happen all that often because it's not expected to happen. But Art Aragon, like you said, is the kind of guy who's pissing off the audience on purpose. He wore, like Gorgeous George, he wore a gold robe. And he would walk down the aisle, like strut down the aisle and like, basically thumb his nose at people and stuff like that. And, go, with it, man. Yeah. Do that type of shit, like a wrestler getting their face and shit. And people hated it, but also loved it. That's the whole thing. And that's the type of shit that Muhammad Ali understood it. Floyd Mayweather clearly understands it, that it doesn't matter. You don't have to be a hero. You don't have to be a nice guy, a good guy, any of that shit. They don't have to want to see you win. They just have to want to see you. That's it.
But they have to know also too that Aragon was a tough guy that
He
fought
was. He
like
was a good fighter. Yeah.
very good fighter, man. He beat Don Jordan, who was a very peculiar case
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
But
Speaking of mafia,
yeah, Jesus. Speaking of just crazy, and gotta do a podcast on him one day. That's an interesting
yeah, he's his
personality to
own.
have.
He's his own, I think.
Um, and to the point where like there was Enrique Bolaños, Chico Villar, who was a very popular fighter
Yep.
in his time period. Like these were all guys. These were a who's who of '50s contenders, and they all fought each other. And I wanted to say the next thing I remember about Aragon too when I was a kid. I don't know if you remember this, Pat, but he was featured. You know how they would do the HBO pre-fight features. He was interviewed and featured, I think, on one of them for a De La Hoya fight.
I'm
When they
not
were
going to
like
say you're
like
wrong.
they
I
were
just don't
meeting,
remember it.
they were like the meeting of the Golden Boys and stuff like that. But yeah,
Oh, well,
Aragon.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't specifically remember that.
I don't remember what fight it was, but that was something that did happen.
I do remember him being mentioned in a few Ring Magazine articles, like, talking about Golden Boy or whatever it was.
But I remember that I think it was with had to have been with De La Hoya because
I'm
who else would
sure.
it have
Yeah.
been? But it was the whole yeah, totally.
Well, somebody, especially if it's somebody who worked on the Olympic Auditorium documentary, might be chiming in and saying, like, hold on, Art Aragon's actually from New Mexico. True, but he did move to LA and fought out of the LA area. So it's, he was a transplant, but he was pretty much from LA at that point. But even more importantly, the environment that he was fighting at, whether it was the Legion Stadium, whether it was Wrigley Field in LA. Don't start sending me DMs talking about Wrigley Fields in Chicago. Look it up. It's in LA at this time. That literally happens every single time I post about Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. Happens every time. But so many of these fighters were Mexican fighters. Chico Bejar, if they weren't Mexican, they were Hispanic, were very tied into the crowds that were often coming to the auditorium, etc. But also Enrique Bolaños, that was a big one, who was very popular in the Mexican community at the time and had started fighting at the auditorium, was popular at the auditorium, and Art Aragon beat him twice. And according to Art, he said that was when fans really started hating him, was when he knocked out Enrique Bolaños, and that, that was their guy. And so they were pissed, and that he just embraced it at that point, that he just kind of leaned into it. But yeah, Carlos Chavez, a number of those guys.
And what's interesting too is that like everyone wants to see a guy like Aragon, like I said, catch his comeuppance, like Gorgeous George would, like other heels in wrestling would, and you always want to see the bad guy finally get flagged. You look at Aragon's record, he lost 20 times. I mean, that happens in that era. That's actually not a bad 90-20 in that era is not
that's a pretty good record in that era.
Considering who he fought. But then you look at how many times he got knocked out or was stopped. Only 3. So at that point, you look at that and you're like, geesh, all right. How many times he would go there and probably make a relatively close fight, but he would always go the distance. And people are just going away pissed off even more because he didn't get knocked out. He wasn't, he wasn't taken out on a stretcher like they wanted.
Yeah. And I mean, he definitely knew how to play that role. There's absolutely no question. There's actually a really funny story that he told years later about Lauro Salas, one of the guys that he fought. I think he fought him twice, maybe even 3 times. But point is, he said that he was a good looking guy. Art Aragon had kind of teen idol looks, as we said, really expressive eyebrows, good looking dude, curly hair. And he said that he was already kind of a womanizer by this point, and he was known for going to a few of the local LA watering holes from time to time. And he had gone to some place on Sunset Boulevard, and he ran into Lauro Salas. He said he walked into the door, and the first thing he saw was, quote unquote, that ugly mug, because he said that Salas was ugly and that he hated him because he was ugly. And that the first thing he saw when he walked in the door was Salas smiling at him. And so he took off his jacket and started fighting him right there. And that they got into a brawl in this restaurant that lasted for this. Witnesses said it lasted upwards of 45 minutes. Can you fucking imagine fighting a guy in like a restaurant for 45 minutes? Like, Jesus Christ.
Salas was a tough MF for himself that had a very, very long career. So, yeah,
And
I suppose.
yeah, I mean, apparently this
Who's
happened
going to try
because
to stop them too? Who's going to
there
try to
was like
stop them too?
multiple witnesses and shit, and they were said that they were
Yeah.
going at it. And so then when apparently they fought the first time, their quote unquote rematch was called the cafe rematch
It's amazing.
because it was a rematch of their brawl. But
Totally.
yeah, Aragon had a bunch of famous things and moments. He was a star in Fat City, that movie. It was a really one of the
Yeah.
better boxing movies about Stockton. He played a trainer in that movie. Man, oh, and against Basilio, just took an absolute fucking just whooping.
A lot of guys did against
Yeah, I mean
Brazil.
that's not
You know,
necessarily saying anything, but still took a
like
whooping.
like Jake LaMotta was the type of guy that took a pretty boy like Tony Gennaro or something and just mauled him and mangled him into a piece of meat. Basilio was the same guy. Once LaMotta retired, Basilio kind of took that role of just taking pretty boys like Aragon and just demolishing them because that's what he did. But Art Aragon was a hell of a character, man. One of boxing's best in terms of that. But I want to go to another pretty boy from the same era who actually fought Aragon, but was a complete opposite of the personality of Aragon in every way conceivable. And in that sense, he was probably a dreamboat for the average housewife or tiny bopper of the 50s. And that's Chuck Davey. And even if you look at Chuck Davey and all that, and you look and be like pretty boy, no, I'm not in the sense of that. But if you look at the time period, what Davey was, what he represented, the whole clean cut image, college graduate, NCAA champion in boxing when they used to have that still for in college, and the whole 9 yards, and the whole time period that he came from. Yeah, he was a media darling. I'm sure those girls were swooning for him.
Yeah, well, and obviously the style that he took too was a different kind of style.
Oh, completely.
And I mean, I guess on some level, we've talked about this before, but the way that fighters generate power and stuff like that, if you don't have power, you don't have power. There's only so many ways you can generate power, and if you're like Paul Spadafore and you just don't have it. You just don't have it,
Mm-hmm.
and you wind up being more of a stylish kind of boxer or whatever, at least compared to a guy like Aragon, who was more giving fans what they wanted a lot of the time. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah, Chuck Davey was a classic boxer. If you watch clips of him, you watch him and you're gonna look at it and be like, what? Because it's not when I say classic boxer, it's even amateur. His style is even amateur for the amateurs, you would say, right? He was very like on his feet, extremely on his feet. He looked like he was always slapping at you, you know, and nothing really looked hard, like you said. He didn't really generate a lot of power, but the fighters were stymied by him. There were rumors swindling. I mean, like he had a very, very good amateur career and he could fight. He wasn't no slouch. Like he had skill. It was just awkward the way he fought, and then it didn't look right, especially for that time period where guys didn't move like that. He stood out, and his look stood out. He was young, but he looked older. He had a receding hairline, the whole freckle thing going on, really pale. He fit in well for the era. And since he was so clean cut and well spoken and all that other stuff, college graduate, he was featured all the time on television during the golden age, Gillette, television fights and all that. Davey was a mainstay for it.
But he did kind of have the like, who I think he kind of looked like? He looked a little bit like Jimmy McLarnin.
Okay, yeah.
Like he kind of had that like, they called Jimmy McLarnin was, I think, the original baby faced assassin. And that's what they used to call him back in the day. There might have been somebody called that before him. I'm not saying he originated it, but I think he was the original famous baby-faced assassin because he was just part of that was because he had started off like I think as a flyweight and was just a little guy, but he was just a fresh-faced, clean-cut white boy, and the same thing. Chuck Davey was just he did have a bit of a receding hairline, but just strawberry blonde-ish looking dude with a nice smile, like a little kid smile type of thing. Looked innocent. I could see it. I could definitely see it, especially when I think in an era like we've talked about several times, in an era where you're expected to be tough, and if you're a fighter, you look tough. You got cauliflower ears, a bunch of scar tissue and shit like that, and he didn't really look like that.
he didn't look anything like that. And the way he fought was the complete opposite of like the, the brutes of that era, or even like the classic boxers of that era, because they didn't move like Davey. Davey stands out. So, when he starts his career, he's off on a whirlwind. He's fighting, not, top guys, but like there's guys out there. If you look at his names, there's scattered ones. For instance, he ends up fighting Ike Williams. Ike Williams is completely past it at this point. And there's questions that Ike Williams might have even thrown this fight. There was little questions about certain fights with Davey's career. Rocky Graziano, I think it was his last fight of his career. He fights Davey, and he kind of sleepwalks.
And Ike Williams was kind of weird about certain portions of his career too, even when he talked about him like decades later. So
Williams was one of those guys that was mobbed up, even though he was known as one of the greatest lightweight champions ever.
And he probably was too, but even so, there was some trouble.
He was with Blinky Palermo.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, for sure. He was one of the mainstays because he was good for sure.
But for instance, like, so there was always like rumblings going on over there. Like, he fought Carmen Basilio twice. First fight was a draw. The second fight, Davey actually did look like legitimately beat him. He beat Chico, the aforementioned Chico Bahar twice. And he, built himself up to a top contendership to fight Kid Gavlin for the welterweight championship. Kid Gavlin at that point, obviously another mainstay, a very popular fighter during the 50s, and one of the most popular fighters of the 50s, gave Robinson absolute hell, and obviously was the heir apparent once Robinson moved up. That was going to be the litmus test. If Davey had somehow won that fight, God knows how much he would have been more featured than that, man. Probably on every like television station that you can have, every Jesus Christ, every TV show that you can imagine back then, he probably would have been on. What's his name? This one, that one, God knows, whatever else they were putting on, Davey would have been on that. You know what I mean? But instead, poor television, people, the average housewife, everyone else watching boxing that night that was rooting for Davey, witnessed an absolute massacre.
I mean, I could see Kid Gavlin, if Kid Gavlin had not just been ugly as sin, he could have been an idol. He had a tremendous style, really fun fighter, a pretty animated guy.
He was cool. Yeah, man. Gavlin was just a fun, happy-go-lucky guy from Cuba that just like had the whole style.
He just had a super goofy look. That's all. I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful. He just looked like a goofy guy, but a tremendous fighter.
And his style was almost like, slightly unorthodox too for that. Like, I mean, just went to his own way and own style, but everything worked out perfectly, bro. But he just tremendous fighter, one of the greatest of all time. And I mean, class showed that.
Great welterweight.
Absolute daylights out of Davey. It was a massacre.
Great welterweight. And, that fight happened in Chicago Stadium. And on top of that, Chuck Davey generally when he fought out of Detroit, he was from somewhere else in Michigan, but he fought out of Detroit. And there were at least two venues in Detroit, and it might have been all of them. I'm not positive. I'd have to look. I'm just kind of going off memory, but I mentioned this recently on some other show. Can't remember which show, when we were talking about the International Boxing Club of New York and how one of the writers at the time had nicknamed him Tentacles Inc. And one of and Tentacles Incorporated, that is. One of the reasons being that they had control of so many cities and venues, and Detroit was one of them. Detroit was one of the cities where the International Boxing Club of New York's mob influence had extended to both Chicago and Detroit. They hadn't really gone a whole lot past there because it's kind of like you think about New York as a hub, and then, you spread down from there on the map. And it's like the more you spread out, the thinner you get, if New York is your hub. So anyway, from that perspective, it makes sense. But Detroit was one of the cities where they were constantly involved, and Chuck Davey was always fighting out of Detroit. So, of course, he was coming into contact with not just the fighters, but I'm sure a lot of the actual players when it came to the mob influence in the sport of boxing at this time, because they were all up in the welterweight and middleweight divisions, no question.
Totally, man. I'm sure people met with him and there was some rumblings going on, but it makes you wonder, because if the Graziano fights on YouTube, and Graziano is past it, but it is kind of interesting to watch a guy who was just always overly aggressive just kind of sleepwalk through 10 rounds. It's not a very exciting fight. Well, Davey just kind of dances around and jabs him to death. Carmen Basilio, I believe, always said that he had fit, he believed everything was really fishy. I think in the first fight or some other stuff that he couldn't get a decision on. The rematch, like I said, I think Davey, by all accounts, clearly won it, but like it just there was always questions going on there, especially when you build up a gaudy record like that you're in an era where it's pretty difficult to build up a record like that. And you're always featured on television, obviously very favored. You have a peculiar style. People are gonna, lay into question, and rightfully so.
Yeah, there's a lot of fighters. There's so much lost footage from the 1950s where fights would be on every week. And it's like fighters, like I mentioned this not super long ago, but long story short, I've been saying for years, I wish I had some boxing connection in my family. And then a couple of years ago, I even said on the show, it turned out that I did. It was just that I didn't find out about it until, way later in life. My mom's uncle used to be army friends with Joe Maselli.
Oh,
and
yes.
The only reason why I bring that up is just to tie it to directly what I just said, where there's so many fights in the 1950s in particular that are basically just forgotten, or these kinds of regular,
a lot of them, man.
Yeah, we did a show about this too, but these regular TV fighters that are basically just forgotten about at this point. Joe Maselli was one of them. He was considered a TV star, and you bring that name up to even some boxing historians, they're like, who, Mahuli? What the fuck? What are you talking about? But that's what I'm saying. Like these guys were regular household names during this era.
I met him actually too at the Hall of Fame. I met him my first year at the Hall of Fame.
That I didn't know. That doesn't surprise me though, because I know he was from that area.
Yeah, he showed up. I got to meet him. I took a photo with him, got his autograph, everything. Actually, the gloves back there, he signed them.
Tough fighter, dude. Very
tough
fighter,
man. If you look at his record too, another one, oh, he couldn't have been that good. Look at his record. No, look at who he fought.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Look at who he fought.
Look at who he fought. All right, it was so hard to become a world champion back then. And look at who he fought, and then see the wins that he has too, because he did not beat a bunch of scrub bums. All right, he beat world champions. He beat top contenders. Yep. Just, you know what I mean? They beat him more than he beat them. But trust me, he was a bad mamma jamma. He could fight.
Yeah, he was on TV regularly. He served in the
Tiger
Army.
Jones, all those type of guys, man. They're always featured on television.
Yeah. So I mean, just to kind of illustrate that, there's so many of these fighters that are basically just forgotten about at this time, and were just household names back then.
But Gavlin but back to Davey really quick, man. Gavlin completely ruined him. After that fight, Davey was literally never the same, man. If we mentioned our Aragon ended up beating him, a guy named Al Andrews beat him twice. Vince Martinez, who I guess you can consider another pretty boy of the era. He was a good looking dude who a lot of people were talking about. He was a popular contender during that weird era. Absolutely ravaged Davey for a knockout loss. So, And he had a tough afterlife too, man. Like I know he was successful after his career ended for a while, but then I believe he had a swimming accident.
I read about that because I was for the show. Right. I read about that and was like, I didn't know that. Holy shit.
I think I read about that in Burst Sugar's Fight Game, actually. Remember the Fight Game magazine from the late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah.
So he had a swimming accident. I think he was diving or something like that, and he ended up he was paralyzed from the neck down, right?
That's the type I had a pool when I was a kid. That was exactly the type of shit that my mom was like, don't dive into the shallow end.
Always, the shit like that will happen, man. I mean, look what happened to poor Zora Foley. Well, I don't know if he.
Who knows what happened to poor Zora Foley?
Yeah, there's so many questions that, but I mean, just like he died though, banging his head off a pool, right? Story goes.
Yeah, that was what their story was saying.
So I mean, it just like it is dangerous, but I mean, like, yeah, poor guy. Like, especially because he wasn't young when he did that. I think he was already like as late middle age, early elderly age or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, that's rough, man.
He does, but I mean, all in all, he does hold a place for this conversation, definitely, and especially for the time period.
on the heels of Chuck Davey, dude, we're gonna fast forward a couple decades, not too many decades, but got a schoolboy to talk about, Mr. Bobby Chacon.
Yes, sir.
Hurry home, boom, boom. Manciini's fighting Bobby Chacon. Every time I bring up Bobby Chacon, somebody brings up that Warren Zevon song too, to the point where I have to be like, yes, I know there's a song that mentions Bobby Chacon, y'all. It's okay. But
it's interesting too that of all fights to mention, but I mean, I guess it rhymes. So
yeah, I think it just fit the rhyme scheme perfectly.
Yeah.
But also, I think that it's funny because it's like, I guess it depends on who you ask. I think if you ask Southern Californians, they love Bobby Chacon. I mean, especially I think a lot of people who wound up seeing him live, really exciting fighter, but one of those fighters that was like right there, like he won a title, but it was like he couldn't quite get like over the hump. He couldn't quite just get, came super close, but at least in terms of entertainment, top fucking notch, dude. Definitely one of the better careers to watch entertainment wise. Incredible.
But he was also a guy that, he definitely burned the candles at both ends early on in his career. And that's what really pushed him up, man. Like he shot out like a rocket, bro. I mean, like you couldn't touch him, especially when he met up undefeated against Danny Little Red Lopez and scored that knockout. I mean, sky was the limit for him, bro. Everybody thought Chacon.
Yeah, dude. There's so many ups and downs in his career and life. Just
totally. But in the beginning of it, man, they thought he was shot on a rocket. And then when he beat Alfredo Marcano, was it right, for the title? No one could have said anything, but like the fame that he got from that. I mean, he was already big and super popular. We've discussed before how the West Coast boxing scene, especially in LA area, really takes to their hometown heroes, even if they're not champions or before they become champions. And Chacon was no different, man. He was already at Matinee Island a star before that. So when he became champion, that was just like the exclamation point. But I don't think anybody could have predicted what was going to happen to him, which was when he fought Ruben Olivares. I mean, like Olivares is an all-time great fighter. Don't get me wrong, but it looked like the careers were going in different directions when they came up. And
yeah, he just had Chacon just kind of looked like a goofy kid, which is why they called him schoolboy.
Yeah,
kind of had that funny haircut early on, but in just 1973 alone, I mean, maybe at least one of these fighters might not be familiar to anybody who isn't like a history buff already, but Turi Pineda, who was a mainstay at the Olympic.
Very popular at the Olympic, man. A guy that never really made it to the heights, but he did fight for a world title and just he usually lost to all the other guys, but a tough guy.
One of George Parnassus' favorites, promoter George Parnassus, one of the guys that he went to a number of times. And then in the same year, he beat Turi Pineda, Frankie Crawford, who was a crowd favorite around that time, and Chucho Castillo, who most people are going to know then. But that was in 1 year. That's a pretty impressive year for a young fighter. That's a very good year.
This is a pretty wild photo. I'm recalling off the top of my head when he fought Pineda, where it shows the contrast in styles. Pineda is completely wide open, what I'm talking about? And Chacon is just popping it with a punch, and Pineda is just taking it with his arms completely stretched. Like,
and Pineda himself also looked like a small child. Like he just had that baby face. So it was like two really little kids fighting, But yeah, he was a goofy looking kid too.
But no, these were all. But again, like Pineda at that point had only one loss. Crawford was already a mainstay at and Castillo was past.
Yeah, he was obviously a veteran, but very well known.
These were man. Chacon built his way up there. Like we said, when he fought Danny Lopez, future all-time, great featherweight champion, Hall of Famer himself. That was a huge crosstown fight right there at the in LA. People were clamoring for that because Indian Lopez's little brother, Ernie Lopez's little brother, I mean, built himself up, a superstar now, and then fighting Chacon. Imagine if that fight was happening today, bro. Like, people would be going bananas for that.
A lot of people forget it was Chacon who took his O.
Yeah, totally. And dominated, man. Chacon was at his peak right there, and he looked beautiful in that fight. He was brilliant.
Yeah, those three wins that I was talking about earlier led directly to his first fight with Olivares, and he lost that fight. But I mean, there's no shame. Like it's, you lose to Ruben Olivares. There's one of the Mexican greats, a guy who's probably even underrated in that department, because you talk about the Mexican greats and, he's generally not mentioned among the top handful. But even so, like you said, he wound up losing. Well, he beat Danny Lopez, took his O, and then lost a rematch to Olivares when a lot of people were like, okay, well, this is the chance for the young kid to bounce back, but then lost it even worse and even sooner. Wound up getting knocked out in the second round. But then it was, I don't know, a couple of years later in 77, I think, when he actually wound up defeating and getting revenge over Olivares. Finally, Olivares, I guess, had gotten old enough for him to beat. But no, I mean, Olivares was still viable, but obviously getting somewhat worn. But Olivares himself was super popular in the Southern California Mexican American community and also really popular in Mexico. His popularity gets downplayed. Just don't want it to get swept under the rug. But going 2-1-1 with Bazooka Limon, losing to Lexus.
He was struggling in a lot of, like, every time he would beat a lot of contenders, build himself up back to a title fight. But even in some of those fights,
that's what I mean, is he couldn't quite get over that hump. He just couldn't.
And a lot, and he was always taking, and like his style was changing from being like, the really slick, fast speedster that he was early on to like becoming more of a brawler. Like he always, he was never like a defensive whiz, but he definitely started becoming the more so like going in there and taking more to earn more and that type of deal. And he was taking punishment in these fights, even in fights that he would be winning. Like, if, for instance, I've never seen it, but I read about it. His fight with David Sotelo. They said that was an out and out brawl that Chacon took a ton of punishment in before he ended up, winning that fight. And that, Shig Fukuyama was another guy that always gave everybody hell. There's that famous photo of him bloodying the crap out of Sean O'Grady. These were guys, like, these were tough fights. And Chacon's wife, he was married to a beautiful girl named Valerie. And she was clamoring, just begging him all the time for years, since the mid 70s, probably since around the Olivares fights, that like, please stop fighting. I don't, you don't need this anymore. There's so many other things you can do.
It was after the sorry to interrupt you, but it was after the Boza Edwards fight.
The first Boza Edwards fight, where she really like started like really demanding,
because it was a brutal, just both of them were absolute fucking wars. And she wanted him to stop. That,
too, he had got stopped against Arguello in a fight that he was actually really competitive and maybe winning it. But like, she was believing he was never going to get over that hump. And Chacon was already a thing of the past at that point. Look how long he had been around. He was still young, but he had fought for so long. It's the early 80s. He almost seems out of place now because it's the early 80s. Like, he seems like caught in a place in the mid 70s with bell bottoms and discos and, what was Mod Squad, for instance. All right, to really throw a reference out there, like stuff like that, right? But like, so him being in the 80s and almost like, you're just kind of like, wait, this isn't, it's not going to work. And it didn't at first. And like you said, after the Boza Edwards fight, who Edwards was a hell of a fighter too, that kind of underrated to a degree, stopped him. His wife soon enough couldn't take it anymore. And, a little while after that, when Chacon scheduled yet another fight, she killed herself. Very, very tragic. You know what I mean? I think she took a shotgun and just took herself out, right?
I don't know what kind of gun it was, but yeah, it was a gun.
Yeah. And then afterwards, I think it was the very next day or that night or the next day, Chacon actually fought, didn't he?
Yeah, it was I don't remember the time frame, but it was something like that. It was something like very soon afterwards.
Right after that, which is,
and he said he was like numb, like he was just like
totally. Yeah, I can't even imagine. But after that, like, that's when his whole turnaround started. Like, for whatever reason, he took that motivation of losing his wife and just like fueled it to win another title, because they always said he wanted to do that for Valerie. And after a string of wins, including another a revenge win over a tough guy named Arturo Leon, he ends up fighting his arch rival Bazooka Limon, and for their fourth and final time. This is the fight that, like, it's one of my all-time favorite fights. I know it's one of yours. It's, anyone who's watched it will tell you it's one of their favorite fights ever. It's that fight is like a Rocky film come to life.
Some people, like I guess it kind of varies by your age. Maybe not. Kind of probably just by personal preference, but I know a lot of people who are kind of like around our age and younger
Mm-hmm.
generally say Corrales Castillo won.
I get that. Totally.
No problem. Yeah, no argument. But I know a lot of people. I know a lot of people who say no. It's, Chacon-Limon 4, Limon Chacon 4. That's the best fight that they've ever seen. No argument. It's one of the best fights ever, for sure.
And the ebbs and flows of it, like Limon was never going to be known as a fancy Dan. He was a caveman in there. I mean, he had a weird style that worked effectively for him, but he was nothing. He was who he was. He was a crude guy that came in and clubbed you down, and he was clubbing the shit out of Chacon.
Unless you were Charmbe Mitchell, in which case he tried to pull down your fucking trunks mid-fight.
Yeah. The fact that he was fighting in 1990 was a travesty in itself. So
yeah, no shit.
But like the ebbs and flows of it. I mean, like if you listen to this show, I'm pretty sure that you've watched the fight. If you haven't, do yourself a favor and give yourself an hour and a half and just sit down and watch it, because it's absolutely incredible the way they go back and forth. You got Limon beating the hell out of Chacon. You got Chacon rallying back with right hand after right hand, which he seemingly couldn't miss from Limon. Limon drops Chacon. Chacon wobbles Limon. It's backs and forth, and somehow going into the very last round, it's basically almost even, or to the point where like Chacon just needs to score a knockdown. He needs to do something big here to score this win. Like that's how close it is. Like it's just, and they both knew it. And then at the very end of the fight, there's like 15 seconds left or whatever, and Chacon just comes and lands a right hand. Limon has nothing left on him. Guy as tough as nails, but he's just splayed out from that one shot. Wobbles back, and Chacon runs in and lands the second right hand. And that's when Limon just lays out. He pulls himself off the canvas, but it's so dramatic and awesome.
It's like the last second, like he needed it,
and somehow he got it.
But it's not only that, it's like, you can almost start like tearing up talking about it, because it's like the culmination of his fucking life. Yeah. Like it's his entire life put into this round.
Yes, totally.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing. And it's like, so yeah, like you go from him being this young idol in the early 1970s in a very busy and entertaining and popular division in an extremely entertaining part of the country as far as boxing goes, couldn't be a better situation for him. And he gave everything he had brain wise, but another part of this too, that we kind of neglected to mention along the way, was that he had also turned to alcohol and drugs too. And he had a lot of personal issues. And around the time that his wife committed suicide, he was having promotional issues on and off, which, likely story for any fighter, but he was having promotional issues with Don King.
Oh, no surprise there.
Like any fighter in the 1980s ever did, So there were a lot of ups and downs in his career. And that fourth fight was really just kind of like, maybe we didn't know it they didn't know it at the time, but that was really like the pinnacle. That was really that was what he had. And then from there to Mancini, and he even had a pretty decent run after that too. He beat Freddie Roach.
Did, man. He ended up fighting Boza Edwards in a rematch, which was another fight of the year. Like Chacon had that second run. Once he beat Limon in that fight, like everybody was just like, oh my God, like that was it. He became, because you said, man, the story behind it, the reclamation, he finally came back, the finish, how great the fight was. You couldn't beat it, man. Chacon was like a star again. And then he goes and he fights Boza Edwards in the second fight and puts on another absolute clinic. Like that was the 83 fight of the year. So back to back, he has fights of the year. 1982 fight might have been the fight of the decade. And then he beats Boza Edwards in the 83 fight of the year. So when he fights Mancini in 84, yes, everybody is very, very excited. I mean, like it's, you can't beat something like that, man. Like, Chacon is the ultimate action star now, and he has all the momentum. Mancini is the big matinee island, the pretty boy of the time, and really, really popular in all action. Everyone thought this was going to be explosive. They thought it was going to be an amazing fight. And, not so much.
Yeah, it was two guys going two different directions. Definitely a crossroads type of fight. Well, I mean, it wasn't like Mancini was like young and fresh per se, but he was definitely in a different part of his career than Chacon was at the time.
Absolutely. And
And
he was a lot bigger too. Chacon wasn't
bigger,
like,
heavier punching. Yeah, just a different fighter at that time. And you add into that the wear and tear that Chacon had.
Chacon had. Absolutely.
He had no more, dude. And I mean, like I said, he still put a couple good wins together after
No,
that.
he
It's not
did,
like he was
man.
done,
He beat Freddie Roach and he beat Art Frias, who was a
but he
former
never
champion.
got that momentum going on like he had
And at that
earlier.
point, like you mentioned too, he had fallen into drugs and alcohol and a lot of stuff with his career. His post fight career was really sad. You know, he had a lot of issues. I know he lost
Unfortunately.
one of his kids was murdered in a gang shootout or something. He suffered from brain damage, dementia later on.
Yeah.
But I will
Even
say, go ahead.
even oh gosh, who was it? I'd have to look at the dude's name because I clicked it, but I think it was Rafael Solis. They had said that after that fight, that during his post-fight interview, that a bunch of the reporters were like, dude, he's slurring real bad. And he even won. He won the fight, but was like sounding bad. And that not long after that, that he had been convinced that he needed to get out, but that not long after he retired, he started using crack.
Mhm. Yeah. And I know he fell in and out. He was like homeless for a few times. Other stuff went on with him. But you know, people in the boxing community, other people rallied and tried to get him together. And he did, even though it was sad what happened to him, and like in terms of his mind and other stuff, like kind of deteriorating. Um, he didn't live out like completely just out off his wits end. He did make it to the Hall of Fame when he got inducted, and even though you can tell he was out of it, like he was very, very happy-go-lucky. He was bouncing around, he was kissing people, taking photos with everybody, he was dancing, smiling. Like you couldn't tell him, like he was the happiest guy on the planet, absolute happiest guy. It was a joy to be around him, actually.
Yeah, he's definitely still kind of like a beloved figure as far as being, especially Southern California
As
figure,
he
no
should be,
question.
and he should be remembered fondly. He was a great fighter, great fighter. He would be
Totally.
huge today if he was around.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
speaking of another pretty boy from that era, actually, we're just going to shift gears a little bit, go from the West Coast to the Midwest.
I
So,
already know who. Go ahead.
Bubblegum Sean O'Brien.
Yep, the bubblegum kid or
Yeah,
whatever variation on the bubblegum.
exactly.
Man,
Someone who might have turned pro. God, when did he turn pro? What was he?
I want to say 15.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Around that age,
I
right?
think 15. But you know, he and his family could be like their own show.
Oh my God, yeah.
Pat O'Grady, Irish Pat O'Grady, man. Sean O'Grady coming from a boxing family, and I guess kind of a quintessential Irish Roman Catholic, strict or stern,
Mm,
well, violent family, from most descriptions, where dad was angry and basically took that anger out on the kids in the boxing gym. And I mean, I think that we saw a similar career trajectory with Freddie Roach, actually, coming from a family that was a boxing family
yeah.
with a really hard charging fucking dad that
Who made
was
him
like,
do all the fighting? Totally.
yeah, like you remember playing little league and there was always that one father in the stands that was like, fuck him up, Tommy, and everybody's looking up like, bro, they're fucking 7. Like,
There's
like
always one.
that was those, yeah, there's like sitting in the stands, you're like,
I
people are
remember a
like,
guy
oh,
like
you
that
having a
too. Oh yeah,
you're having
yeah.
a soda and
I
sitting there
just had a
drinking a fucking
flashback,
beer.
man. I just had a flashback. Do you remember this fighter recently from the? I'm sure you do. Ryan Kielzeki,
That sounds super
Polish
familiar.
Prince, was his name. He never he fought on ESPN and a couple other cars. He
That
never
sounds
was like
super
a world
familiar.
beater.
Yeah.
But so he's from Massachusetts, all right. And I remember him when he was because I'm older than him. I remember him when he was a little kid and when he was like first at the Junior Olympics. Bro, he used to have his dad there. And the same thing, his dad would be sitting next to everybody and blow like his like you make like I'm telling you the decibel levels that he would start screaming because he was a big guy. Kill him, Ryan! Kill him! Yeah, get him now! Like these kids were 7 years old, bro. And they're just like kind of, they're going through it. No, give us that jab. Right hand him. Hit him with the uppercut. Woo! Woo! One time he started
you hear
doing,
like a you look over and he's like just pounding a beer. You're like, you
I
brought
mean,
another
bro, he
fucking
was
little league.
violent
What the
one
fuck
time.
you
He was
doing?
over there. He was like, woo, 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 woo. I'm like, what the?
Jeez, like it's a game. It's a sport, sir.
I know, bro, man. It was
down.
wild. Everyone used to run away from him because he would just be a central figure. No. But yes.
Yeah, like you didn't know he may or may not pick a fight with one of the teenage players after the game. Who knows?
Absolutely.
Maybe not. Who knows?
My friends actually beat up they said they did that. They're my football team. And I wasn't on the team, but in New Bedford High School, my friends told me how they beat up a dad after the school after a game one time because he got all loud with them. They said they walked up, my buddy Bunny punched him in the head, dropped him, and the rest of them stomped him out.
I won't name names because I know this guy now, but when I was a kid, his dad, my older brother and his older brother were on the same soccer team. And after the game, his dad almost got into a fight with one of the players on the other team who was like 15 at the time because he thought they were being too rough. Anyway, imagine all of these psychotic fathers we're talking about, and that's Pat O'Grady. That's
totally.
Just somebody who's overbearing. Obviously,
Sean boxing at 6 years old. At 6 years old, you don't even know.
Obviously, living out some fantasy of his own through his children. That quintessential, sad shit, bro. Sad shit.
So Sean O'Grady starts boxing as an amateur at 6 years old, and in 1975, while he's probably, I want to say he was like still like a sophomore in high school or so, he turns pro and starts hitting the Midwest circuit, which was even more skeezy and slummy and questionable in the 70s compared to what it still is today. So
if you think the regulation now is bad,
imagine what it was. Too bad we don't have our buddy Gray Johnson on the show today.
Oh my god, dude, he could probably name names
and the inroads of what went down in the 70s of the Midwest when you fought at the Red Carpet Inn in Oklahoma City or the Memphis Blues Ballpark, for instance. So those were the O'Grady stomping grounds of the mid 70s. Anyways, he built his up record on the Chitlin circuit, just beating up a bunch of debutants and guys with sham records, probably with fake names and all that, until randomly, out of the blue, very quizzically, in 1976, only a year after turning pro, don't get me wrong, he fought a lot in that first year. He gets matched against the aforementioned Danny Lopez. And what happened there, Pat?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, one of the issues with Freddie Roach and specifically also Sean O'Grady, his skin, and it became a recurring issue. You could see it now. He still speaks very well. He doesn't look so bad, but you could see the scar tissue.
He got out of the game very young too. And
thankfully, because if he would have stayed in, that just would have been such bad news. But overall he looks fairly fresh-faced, but you can still see some scar tissue from where he's probably had to get like plastic surgery and shit like that. But dude, that was like his calling card. It was if he wasn't fighting a scrub, his face was falling apart, unfortunately. But it's tough to this was a competitive kind of the featherweight and lightweight divisions in the 70s and 80s, highly competitive. Why he was put in against Little Red Lopez in that with that few fights, I have no idea. Awful idea, but that's also became a recurring theme with Sean O'Grady's career and his father's decision-making ability. Unfortunately,
there was rumors I've read in a couple of things. There was like rumors saying that O'Grady was getting too big for his britches, maybe, and that his father wanted to humble him, so he put him in with somebody he knew he was going to be overmatched with. But here's the thing: there's no footage of this fight. There's no video footage. This has been like a holy grail for boxing for tape collectors for years. Lee Rose will tell you a lot of other people. There's again rumors of why there's no footage of this fight. There's various things where they said that the O'Grady family had it and they destroyed it, or so and so it just wasn't filmed. Whatever it may be, I don't know. But there's no footage that's ever come up of it. We've just seen photos, and it's clearly man against boy. Like Lopez was in his 20s at this point too, but he looks decades older than O'Grady. who's 18 and looks like a baby. I mean, he already looked baby face as it is, but he's in high school.
Yeah, Danny Lopez was one of those dudes who like had a full mustache like when he was a
Yeah,
senior
man.
in high school.
Oh,
You know what I'm saying?
the hair, the everything. He just looked old. You know, he looked like a guy from the 70s. Just like a tough, rugged guy that, you know, looked decades older than what he was. O'Grady was the opposite.
I've heard stories, not this fight per se, but I've heard stories about other fights where the footage was stolen by by rival promoters and shit like that. But anyway, I'm not going to start with that rumor. I'm just saying I've heard things like that happening. But anyway, yeah, dude, to be put in against Little Red Lopez, just not a good idea. Danny Lopez was the kind of guy who obviously could be beaten and had a lot of flaws. But if you were not about that life, dude, Danny Little Red Lopez was going to let you know.
And the same thing, if you read what happened, they said that O'Grady, by his account, he said he got a little too greedy in the fight. In the first round, he employed a hit and run tactic, and Lopez is one of the slowest starters in boxing history. So it wouldn't be difficult to win the first round against him. But once he got into gear and once he started moving his arms, you know, that's when the curtains will be called. And inevitably, that's what happened to O'Grady. I think it was, they said, you know, a series of punches. He just got overwhelmed. He was a kid. He had no business being in there with him. But the potential was there. Even though he got beat up, he got stopped. Even Lopez said afterwards, give him a few years, he's going to be a great fighter one day. And he went back on the circuit. Same thing. Went back to the Red Carpet Inn, went back to St. Albert High School, Council City Bluffs, Iowa, the Fairgrounds International Building, places like that. You know what I mean? A bunch of cream puffs and stale guys and other random bums. But around the way, too, he would always have like a little name thrown in there. For instance, Shig Fukuyama, who we talked about, a Japanese fighter who was a fringe contender of the featherweight division during the time, and fought a who's who of everybody. There's a famous photo of O'Grady, his face completely gored, looked like Ric Flair after a steel cage match against Bruiser Brody, like just covered.
Yeah, that's a super bloody fight.
And in a fight like that today, there was no way in hell that fight would be let go today. Like O'Grady,
I know I have that, but I think it might have gotten deleted.
Might be,
or at least the copy that I had got deleted off YouTube. But hopefully it's up. I want it to be up.
Yeah, man, it's a pretty exciting fight, especially when you see how gory it gets. But finally, as O'Grady starts maturing and he enters his early 20s, that's when he finally starts fighting tough competition. And it shows to his credit, you know, even though he fought like his record was padded with a lot of guys, he did show his potential, because when he did step up, it wasn't like he got blasted out like a lot of guys usually tend to do they have records. He didn't do that. He ends up fighting Arturo Leon, who was a very tough contender during that time, and wins the USBA title, makes a couple of defenses of that belt. And, you know, at that point maintains against decent fighters, Gonzalo Montalto. And then that's when he fights in a very controversial fight. He ends up challenging for his first world title fight in 1980 against WBC lightweight champion Jim Watt in Scotland.
Yep. Scottish dude, Jim Watt. You know, oh man, poor Sean.
If you're familiar with Jim Watt, it's because you heard of his commentary over the years on, what was it, like Sky and stuff?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a fairly I guess popular, or at least known, player among the UK production stuff and contemporary boxing from a couple of years ago. But also a pretty good fighter too, no question. Very good lightweight. Definitely one of the better Scottish fighters of all time, for sure.
And a tough guy too, man. I mean, he came up in an era like post Duran, where the lightweight division was kind of open. A very rough era too. Even though Duran was gone, there was still a lot of very, very tough fighters. And Watt, to his credit, who wasn't considered much and probably was a little past it when he finally won his belt, because he had been around the block for a while, put himself together a decent little run. Like, he fought O'Grady. He was the first one to beat Howard Davis Jr. in a fight he wasn't expected to win. And he made a few other defenses too before he lost to Alexis Arguello, which was obviously no shame in that. But when Sean O'Grady ends up fighting Jim Watt, controversy arose, because it was a fight that O'Grady was winning by all accounts. I mean, it's on YouTube. It was a tough fight, close fight, but one that O'Grady walked into,
fucked up so bad, dude,
so badly. And it's a fight that they said there was already a lot of tension walking in, because O'Grady I think he's like Catholic or Protestant or something. He said he was, but wherever they were heading, they said that they had a lot of threats. Like Scottish people were threatening, the families. Pat O'Grady was saying that they were getting death threats and other threats and all this stuff, and there was a lot of tension. It was just a scary place to be out there. It was just a lot going on. But when the fight was going on, O'Grady was fighting his ass off. It was a good fight, but O'Grady, he's a tough kid. He's winning. But like you said, dude, he gets headbutted. And he gets headbutted so bad. It's just like a jagged cut that just like, and it starts to begin of the end. And out there, they're not going to take care of him. It's not like it's going to go to the scorecards. So he gets butted, at this point, it becomes a really bad affair. O'Grady, like you said, his face falls apart and he gets stopped controversially.
He still looks like a young kid at this point, he still looks like a little guy. And the cut is like kind of toward the inner part of his eyebrow, up his head, up his forehead. Man, definitely one of the worst cuts you'll see because it's in just such a bad spot. And he's been cut several times before by this point. Like he's used to being cut. He's been cut before, but just a really bad cut in a really bad situation, the worst time in the worst possible place where there's going to be no mercy shown, and
Totally.
There wasn't. So, I mean, I think that was kind of considered the like last hurrah, despite the fact that he was like 22 or 23 at the time, he was still young, but it was like, how many more times could this kid get propped up with scrubs and then get propelled to like a title fight or something like a title fight? How many times can this happen despite the fact that he's still young? Like this can't keep happening because he's just, who knows what kind of punishment he was taking in the gym too. Man.
Oh God, man! Imagine the sparring that he was going on, not just with because I'm sure Pat O'Grady had him sparring with just an assortment of different bruisers and lug wrenches and just other Monty Masters.
Probably sparring dudes who were like light heavyweights and shit
totally,
like that.
Anything goes over when in that land. But to his credit, after one win, he ends up fighting Hilmer Kenty. And Hilmer Kenty at that point, we've talked about him in the past episodes, Kronk's first world champion. At that point, 20-0. He became, just a star, a rising star in the division, and most people thought a rising star in boxing overall. And O'Grady was, even though he was like very popular, he was brought in as the opponent for that fight. He wasn't expected to be Kenty. Kenty was on the rise, not O'Grady. And O'Grady put on a beautiful performance, bro. He just outboxed Kenty, dropped him, just out everything him. Kenty couldn't get going, and O'Grady whooped him for a full 15 rounds. It wasn't even really that close. That was a classic performance.
Yeah, that definitely was probably, it was unexpected, no question, especially with the career trajectory of Hilmer Kenty at the time, being Kronk's first world champion. Exactly. And then Kronk obviously picking up a lot of momentum right around the early 1980s because it was Hilmer Kenty, and then fairly quick succession after that, Tommy Hearns came, and I'm pretty sure that was at Joe Louis Arena that he won that too at Detroit. Yep. But I mean, like already it was like, damn, Kronk's this is the new shit in town right now. Kronk's kicking up. But then Sean O'Grady stepped in and put on pretty much the performance of a lifetime at that point. And I think in retrospect, we're able to kind of put it in perspective, like that Hilmer Kenty obviously was not that good overall, but nonetheless,
no, it was still considered. No, it was a very surprising win. And with O'Grady being, young and popular and good looking and scoring a big win like that, there was a lot of talk. Everyone was excited. Oh man, let's put can O'Grady fight Arguello? Can O'Grady fight this guy, that guy? Like there was so many possibilities of who they wanted to match him up with. There was a World Boxing magazine that my parents bought me at some trade fair or some shit. I don't know. But it was like from that era, and they were talking about Sean O'Grady, and they had him and they interviewed him for the magazine. They listed all the potential opponents that he could fight, and he was going through each of them and talking about how he would beat them, like Howard Davis and this one and that one, and how exciting it would be to fight them and the potential of him fighting these guys. But that wasn't meant to be, man, because I think the O'Gradys were looking for a big cash out after that fight, and instead the WBA wanted him to fight their number one contender, which was a fighter by the name of Claude Noel. Claude Noel wasn't a bad fighter at all, a long-time contender himself, but he wasn't a household name and a guy that wasn't going to command a lot of money or, notoriety. the O'Grady's were looking for something bigger than that. So WBA, who in that, you know, being that they are, they stripped him. And this is where things get interesting, because after they strip him, Pat O'Grady decided in his infinite wisdom, well, we don't need a sanctioned body, we'll create our own. And thus became the WAA.
The World Athletic Association.
Yes, with 2 world champions, Sean, and at heavyweight, the dad's son,
yeah, his brother-in-law, Sean's brother-in-law.
Well, yeah, Sean's brother-in-law, Monty Masters. Yeah.
Jesus Christ, dude. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like so crackpot-ish, bro. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, that's like some shit that you could totally see like Angel Garcia doing, you know, like Ruben Guerrero or something.
And then the funniest thing is that it completely
first bring a gun into New York and then create a fucking organization. Go ahead.
And then the funniest thing about it, bro, is that it blows up in their face completely, because the first WAA.
Yeah, they got that Hawaiian punch on their ass.
Yeah, they fight Andy Gannigan, who's one of the most dangerous fighters of the era, and just an absolute nightmare as for a style. And you know, predictably, unfortunately, he got splattered.
Yeah,
I think he was supposed to fight Howard Davis. Davis pulled out, and Gannigan came in as a late replacement. Gannigan was dangerous as shit.
He was a puncher. He was a guy with a kind of funky delivery, not super orthodox, very
fast,
thudding puncher, and would surprise the shit out of you. And did Sean O'Grady. And you know, that was another guy who, it's unfortunately not quite enough to do its own like big true crime episode, but like he met a super sad end. He Andy Gannigan, that is, he got beaten up by like, it was like some like bar goer or something like that, just randomly, and he wound up dying from his injuries, like
kind of like Don Jordan.
Just terrible shit, dude. Yeah, just crazy shit. But anyway,
in his prime, dude, Gannigan was a fun fighter. He didn't have and what made him even better too is that he didn't have a great chin, so you could hurt him. Yeah, I mean,
so he was hilarious. I don't know if you've ever seen interviews, but dude, he was hilarious. Like every single interview, they're just like, "How do you think the fight's gonna go?" And he's like, "Man, I don't know how it's gonna go." Like every single one, it's like, dude, this guy's a fucking goofball.
If you haven't seen his fight with Arguello, definitely worth a watch too.
Yeah, dude, he's gets folded by some body shots. No shame there.
But he dropped Arguello, man, and just he's dangerous. Like you said, he was kind of like a poor man's Pacquiao in terms of, like you said, herky jerky, funky, unorthodox a little bit, but just dangerous as shit, and just the worst type of style that a guy that O'Grady was going through the motions. You can tell there was a lot going on with him. There was a lot of out of the ring politics. His head probably wasn't in the game. He's defending some shim-sham title that his dad just brought up. And now he's fighting a different opponent. He's expected to fight Howard Davis Jr., who is a completely different style and a light puncher.
Oh, yeah.
And now he's fighting a monster.
Great amateur. And,
yeah. But the guy couldn't break an egg. Now he's fighting a monster.
Yeah, definitely some different preparation would go into that for sure. But needless to say, that was a massive derailment. Massive derailment for Sean O'Grady. But he was still at the time like 23 or something like that.
You know, I mean, and
this is a lot of career to have gone through at only 23, you know?
Considering, absolutely, man. But his career never really got back on track after.
No.
You know, he had a couple of wins, but then he loses to Pete Ranzani, who was past at that point too, another long-time contender. And then he fights a loudmouth from New York named John the Heat Veterosa. If you're a fan from the East Coast and you've been a long-time fan, you probably remember Veterosa from the 80s. He was a New York fighter, very, very loud, very braggadocious, but fun. A very fun fighter too, and he had an all-action style. He was a short guy with kind of short arms, but he was like a windmill, and he was tough. And he ends up stopping O'Grady, man. Like a guy like Veterosa, O'Grady should have beaten, only a few years ago. But you can tell by the time they ended up locking horns, O'Grady wasn't there. It was past it, it just wasn't right. And Veterosa beat him up and stopped him. So O'Grady, I think, even though, like you said, he was young, he was 24, he'd been boxing since he was 6 years old. That's like 3 careers already at that point, So
yeah, dude.
He even knew the time was the call, and he did. And that was the best decision he ever could have made for his life, because he got out at the right time. He got out with his mind intact. He never really suffered any issues from it. He still had his good looks, and he's had a great career as a broadcaster after that.
I think he occasionally still does stuff,
Yeah.
but yeah, he was on Tuesday Night Fights.
Yeah, memorably for Tuesday Night Fights. Yep, Al Albert and the champ Sean O'Grady.
Yep. And I mean, like, I'm not gonna lie and say it was like my favorite duo or whatever, but they were solid.
No, but
they were pretty solid.
And it was just a fun show, man. On Tuesday nights to be able to watch it, you never really knew what was going to happen to, because sometimes some random shit would go down, and
yeah, that was a great series.
Yeah, it was cool. So definitely,
yeah, that was definitely a good series. All right, I think we got time for one more. Let's say
sounds good.
I think we could get a really good one in there.
Do it.
This is, and also I think this is a very good representation of the idol or matinee idol, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Mando Ramos.
Yes.
For good sure. Call. And I
wouldn't have brought him up either, but good one.
I apologize because I've stuck to Southern California for much of this, but
a lot of pretty boys in Southern California, man. I don't know what's going on in the ocean over there.
Look at me. I'm, so
put your face on a stamp, Pat.
Look at me. God. But no, I think I explained earlier. Hopefully I adequately explained earlier why I kind of stuck to this area. But Mando Ramos, lightweight champion from 1969, 1970. And then he also won the title again in 1972. But also, this is a pure Southern Californian from Long Beach, California. But actually, there's some, there are also a lot of really good stories about Mando Ramos. I won't tell them all, just do a couple because they're fun. But Don Chargan, definitely a legendary promoter in California. For a number of decades, was somebody who was behind a lot of fighters and a lot of fights being put together in California on a number of different levels, from the world-class level on down. And in any case, Don was visiting the Ramos household in San Pedro, California at some point when Mando was like 16 or something like that. And he was looking for Mando Ramos' older brother, Junior. And apparently when he'd gone to his house, Mando Ramos stepped up and said, "I don't know why you're looking for my brother. I'm the real fighter in the family." And I guess just the swag, the braggadociousness, whatever, impressed on Chargan. And he kind of, started paying attention to Mando Ramos. Ramos had longer, kind of shaggy, curlier hair, good looking kid, definitely very popular with women. And on top of that, so a guy named Cal Eaton used to be a big promoter in Southern California in LA, and he died in 1966. His wife, his widow, Eileen Eaton, wound up taking over at the Olympic Auditorium and being the main promoter at the Olympic Auditorium. Eileen Eaton,
Judo Gene LaBelle.
You got it exactly. At least part of the story. Yeah. And for anybody who's like, Gene LaBelle, it's the judo fucking godfather, who was also for a number of years Ronda Rousey's judoka teacher, master, whatever you want to call it. In any case, goes far beyond Ronda Rousey. But if you've ever seen any martial arts movies from like the 70s or 80s, I guarantee you've seen Gene LaBelle, because he was in like every single one of them. But
and he also choked out Steven Seagal. So
yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. He made Steven Seagal shit himself. he choked.
I love Gene LaBelle. He's one of the baddest men to ever walk the planet. It's just
like, this is like a verified story. Choked Steven Seagal unconscious and made him shit himself. Mm-hmm. A blessing of a person. Absolute fucking delight. But that was Eileen Eaton's son.
Yeah.
Stepson, son, something like that. In any case, Eileen Eaton wound up becoming almost certainly the most famous woman promoter of all time, one of the most successful, if not the most successful, and was an absolute mainstay. Everybody knew her in LA in the fight scene, and Mando Ramos was her favorite fighter. Mando Ramos was her go-to guy. I think she just liked him, not like that, but just he was a likable guy. He was a likable dude and a likable fighter. In any case, by the early 1970s, though, by the time he had gotten the lightweight title again, he'd already started using drugs, regularly drinking alcohol, and those things quickly, very quickly brought his career down to contender level and then below, like real quick. And he wound up having to
he talked about that in full length many times, how badly he fell off because of all the drugs and alcohol he was doing, which was immense.
He wound up having to basically retreat and fight overseas and then fight these kind of odd venues around LA. And he went from a just mega star, local mega star, to just an also ran, dude, real quick.
And it happened really fast, man, because when he came on the scene, bro, like he was, that like you said, he was good looking. Everybody liked him. He suffered a couple of early losses, but I mean, again, if that happens, that's not the end of the world, especially in the 60s. So by the time he finally fights Carlos Teo Cruz, for another completely forgotten fighter from the lightweight champion from back in the day, he ends up losing a competitive decision to him. No shame in that. Teo Cruz was a really good fighter who had an unfortunate ending. But when he fought him in the rematch, he ended up stopping him on a cut, but became lightweight champion. But like you said, dude, the fame, the everything that got to him really quick, just being like the darling of the LA scene, and now being the lightweight champion, just kind of, shit really just took over really fast for him. He was still able to beat some good guys like Yoshiaki Numata, who was a former junior lightweight champion, another guy completely forgotten and a very tough dude. There's a famous photo of him when he fought Numata, because he stopped him around 6, of Numata in agony on the canvas, and he's laying there, and you see Rojas being pulled away. Not Rojas, excuse me. You see Ramos being pulled away, staring down at him. It's like a black and white photo. It's really cool. But so yeah, these were contemporary guys. They all fought each other around then, But by the time he ends up fighting Esmail Laguna, who, again, a Hall of Famer, just dominant, really, really badass lightweight, who's forgotten because Roberto Duran came on only a few years after him. He was probably past it at that point. I'm sure you would agree with that. I'm sure he was already in the thralls of drugs and alcohol, but he was still able to compete to a degree, relatively at the top. But the signs were already there that he was slipping at. Things were going down. Jackie McCoy, for instance, the Hall of Fame manager and trainer, and Ramos's right-hand man, had noticed the slide immediately. He documented it in his book, definitely, In the Corner, where he talked about Ramos thoroughly and talked about what all the stuff was going on with him and his various issues and how he had to deal with it, and just kind of
Well, I don't remember what I want to say. It was maybe the most controversial endings or something like that. We did a show where we talked about Mando Ramos lost to Pedro Carrasco, the Spanish dude.
Yeah, by disqualification, correct?
Yeah, where it was, just absolute bullshit. Carrasco was a guy who was so Spanish Bulldog. What's his name? Bantamweight champion from the 1930s. Help me out here.
Hold on. It's coming to me right now. Baltasar Sangchili.
Thank you. Baltasar Sangchili. Yeah. Yes. Baltasar Sangchili is, depending on who you ask, considered the first Spanish world champion. But there was kind of a weird push and pull with the bantamweight, because you look at the European title and the lineage of the European title versus the lineage of the titles that Panama Al Brown held, and it's kind of like he winds up getting stripped at, I think, 2 different points. Anyway, long story short, it gets a little bit cloudy. So it depends on who you ask as far as whether or not Carrasco is or whether Sangchili's the first champion. If you don't believe he was, then Pedro Carrasco would be the first Spanish world champion. That's how long it was between world champions in Spain, unfortunately. But that was super controversial ending because Ramos was whooping that ass, and then the referee just you hit him low, and then ends the fight. It's crazy, and it wound up being super controversial. But the Spanish fans went nuts; they loved it. It was crazy, man. But anyway, we brought up Mando Ramos. I'm pretty sure we brought up on that controversial ending show, and we talked a little about that. If anybody wants to go back, but. Yeah, Mando Ramos had a lot of really interesting moments in his career too, and they talk about him on that documentary a little bit as well.
After that, after his fights with Carrasco, he ends up fighting Chango Carmona, brutal of a fighter. And at this point, man, Ramos has documented that throughout his career, after his career ended. that he was in the thralls of drugs at this point. He was drinking all the time. He was doing all kinds of crazy shit, heroin, all the stuff you can name it. He was doing it, and he was cooked. You know, he was completely cooked. His last big wins that he had before the Carrasco fight were against his good friend Raul Rojas, another kindred spirit that had a very dark future ahead of him, and Sugar Ramos, who was already past it at that point. But by the time he lost to Chango Carmona, his career was cooked, man. He lost to Cherry Pineda, and then he started losing to other guys that he never would have lost to beforehand. And McCoy used to say it too, like, these are guys are absolute bums that you're losing to. You get whooped by. Like, this is, I don't, you know. And pretty soon he was completely washed, you know, and only in his mid-20s, a guy that went from like being on top of the world to having absolutely nothing. And it took him a long time after his career ended to really get himself together and pull himself together. But to his credit, he was able to do that.
Just one last little tidbit in there since you brought him up. Chango Carmona is that Mando Ramos fight, but the fight between Mando Ramos and Chango Carmona is credited as being the fight that started the tradition of fights happening on Mexican Independence Day weekend.
Oh, wow. I never knew that. That's pretty awesome.
True fucking story. Chango Carmona, he's the fighter who is, and I actually have a photo of him somewhere. He's an old dude now, but
still alive?
Super nice guy. And anyway, yeah,
nice.
Decent little tidbit to take to the cocktail parties for sure. But yeah, Mando Ramos, I think, is a really good example of that kind of, you know, classification of fighter.
Oh, no, totally. And I'll tell you something too, man, about him. If you go in and you look at his record afterwards too, like you go on BoxRec really quick, you see they ended up in Germany randomly for a few fights, and then just kind of hit like the circuit. He ends up at the Silver Slipper in Las Vegas, which used to hold Wednesday fights every Wednesday, in a smoke-filled little room that like sometimes would feature contenders, prospects, journeymen, whatever you want to name it, but they would always just be like a handful of fights. And when you end up on that circuit near the end, then you kind of know it's the end for yourself.
All right. I apologize. One last tidbit, people. The Silver Slipper is the venue credited with starting Ring Card Girls.
That's awesome.
All right.
But that's true though. Like, you would agree with that about the Silver Slipper. That was just like the Vegas circuit fights. And a lot of guys built their records at the Silver Slipper that ended up becoming contenders, but there was also just like an endless sea of journeymen that just kind of fought each other every Wednesday there.
Yes. It's kind of like State Line.
Yeah, totally.
It's like State Line, dude. It's like you ain't to Vegas yet. Like, you know, you might hit the Silver Slipper because you aren't to, like, you know, well, Vegas hadn't really been, you know. I guess it kind of depends because it had already been started, but it hadn't really been kicked into high gear. But anyway, long story short, yeah, dude, for sure. Silver Slipper was a little more secondary.
For sure. And I also, to add the last thing on Mando Ramos, I actually own his fist casting, which is pretty, from the Hall of Fame. You want to know why? So here's a funny story. When he wasn't inducted, like the Hall of Fame does a thing where for inductees, they do your fist casting, and for people visiting for the first time, they'll, you know, former champions, whatever, they'll usually do your casting. So when Ramos got there, that was the one and only time I met him. Actually, back over here, I have a photo of he and I together. When I look, hold on, let me grab this shit, see if I can show it.
That's wild, bro. I didn't know that.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So I don't know if it's gonna glare or not, but here's me and Ramos. Look how goofy I look as a kid. Yeah, my God.
Bro, you definitely got an A in biology.
Yeah, nah, man. I was not smart in school. I just looked like a nerd, but for whatever reason, I just definitely not. But yeah. Anyways, so I was up there with him. He was getting his fist casted, right? And Ramos, as you can see, he was like, he had gained a lot of weight and his balance wasn't great or anything. So we had to set him down to do it. And for the key for a fist cast to work is that you cannot move your arm at all. Yes, I know it's difficult, but
so he messed it up, and you got to keep the messed up one.
Yeah, because my fingers, well, I'm trying to hold his wrist in there too because they needed my help. I'm trying to hold his wrist in there, and he moved it, and my fingers end up stuck in there with him. So when I pulled it out and they handed it to me the next year, I have his fist, but then you see my pinky and like my thumb and like another finger kind of like caught on the side of it. Just there.
Yeah, but literally, bro, but that's literally not one other fucking person on the planet. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, I
that's like
know.
the
Yeah.
most unique shit. God, that's fucking cool.
Yeah, I have his fist casting with my fingers attached to it. Yep.
I mean, it's mundane to you, but it's pretty cool to me anyway.
No, it's pretty awesome, man. I mean, I've had it for so long now that I kind of like just whatever about
Yeah,
it.
that's
But like,
wild.
I remember when I first got it, I was staring at it. I was like, this is crazy. And he didn't have a big fist. It was fat because I said his fingers were really fat and everything. But like, he was cool. He was a really nice guy. He was very happy to be there.
You're my teen idol now.
Yeah, man. But
Wow,
that
bro, that's
was a
cool.
cool little story. Yeah.
That's awesome, dude. Well, hey, man, everybody who listened in and watched this teen idol, matinee idol, whatever kind of idol episode, man, we appreciate you. Thanks so much, because we've been getting some good feedback from the shows lately, and that's definitely keeping us going. I think it's keeping our motor going a little bit. Anyway, I won't speak for Aris, but I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely, man. This is kidding me. All the feedback that we get, man, is beautiful. So I
Yeah,
appreciate
man,
it.
it's great.
I'm just
So
having fun doing this. So
yeah, it's so much fun for me too. So thank you, dude. Thanks again for taking the time and putting in the work, for sure. Again, if you listened in though, if you listen in via the podcast apps, please subscribe, leave us a rating. We like those things. We like feedback. If you watched on YouTube, also subscribe. Please leave us a comment, reply, whatever the case may be, helpful. But also, as far as social media goes, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on both Facebook and on Instagram. We're also on Twitter, though, and we're individually there. Aris is there as Punch Zone Aris. I'm there as Patrick M. Connor, and we'll hopefully see you there, Aris. Talk to you soon, bro.
have a good one, everyone. Thanks.